They told you to hold on, to outcomes, to people, to plans, to the version of life you imagined. They taught you that acceptance means giving up, that letting go means losing, that peace comes only when everything finally goes your way. Why does your mind keep spinning, replaying the past, rehearsing the future, gripping what is already slipping away? The truth is simple. You suffer when you resist life. You suffer when you demand permanence in a world that constantly changes. Real freedom begins the moment you stop fighting what is and stop chasing what isn't. Accept what comes. Release what goes. This is the heart of Buddhist detachment, not coldness, not indifference, but a soft, steady wisdom, the kind that lets you breathe again, the kind that makes life feel lighter, the kind that frees your mind from the constant storm of why, how, and what if. For thousands of years, these teachings have shown people how to live without fear of change, without clinging, without drowning in emotion. They teach you how to stay open when life shifts, how to let moments pass without grabbing onto them, how to trust the flow instead of fighting the current. Your chest will feel lighter, and you'll begin to understand that real peace comes not from holding everything together, but from finally letting things move as they need to. This isn't just another message to calm your mind. This is a transformation, a quiet turning point, a new way of being. Are you ready to accept what life brings? Are you ready to release what life takes? Let's begin. You move forward now with a quiet shift happening inside you. Not a dramatic change, not a sudden breakthrough, just a gentle release. The kind that feels like something inside your chest finally loosening. A part of you begins to sense that life doesn't have to feel so heavy. There's a soft curiosity waking up, a pull toward a way of living where peace comes not from controlling everything, but from letting life unfold without constant pressure. Something in you wants to understand this more deeply, and with that quiet openness, the next teaching naturally begins to take shape. Most of the pain you carry does not come from your experiences themselves. It comes from what your mind immediately does with them. Your mind reacts quickly and aggressively. It wants to control the moment before the moment even exists. It tries to fix emotions as soon as they arise. It tries to manage people's responses before they've even spoken. It tries to predict every outcome, avoid every mistake, and solve problems that haven't happened. Your mind treats life as if it were an urgent situation requiring constant supervision. This habit feels normal because you've done it for so long. But living in this state makes even small experiences feel overwhelming. The instinct to interfere turns ordinary moments into tension. It creates layers of mental noise that drown out your natural clarity. A passing feeling becomes a crisis. A simple mistake becomes a self-attack. A moment of uncertainty becomes a threat. The mind's interference becomes the real source of suffering, not the situations themselves. There is a quiet truth beneath all this noise. Not everything needs your effort. Some things settle on their own. Some emotions dissolve if you let them be. Some situations calm down when you stop trying to force them into shape. You do not need to fix every moment, and life does not need your constant involvement to unfold. Allowing becomes a discipline, a new way of relating to your thoughts and emotions. It is the deliberate practice of stepping back instead of stepping in, not in a careless way, not in a withdrawn way, but in a wise and grounded way. You learn to give space instead of pressure. You learn to let things breathe. You learn to trust that stillness has a strength of its own. This discipline does not mean giving up or being passive. It does not mean letting life collapse or ignoring responsibility. Allowing is a form of intelligence. It is understanding that peace often grows when you stop interfering with everything inside you. It is the recognition that you can't force clarity, can't force calm, can't force perfect outcomes. You can only allow things to settle at their own natural pace. The belief that you must constantly guide life creates deep exhaustion. You may find yourself always bracing for what might go wrong, always anticipating problems, always planning for scenarios that never arrive, always feeling as if you are holding life together with your bare hands. This effort creates tension in your body and noise in your mind. You feel tired, not because your life is difficult, but because your mind is working far beyond what reality requires. Allowing frees you from this unnecessary labor. A difficult feeling becomes just a feeling. An uncertain moment becomes just a moment. A setback becomes just part of your path. You stop adding the heavy layer of resistance that turns normal challenges into emotional storms. You begin to experience events as they are, not as threats. This discipline begins with awareness. You start noticing the speed of your thoughts, the urgency you feel to react, the pressure you place on yourself to solve, fix, or control things immediately. You witness the mind creating stories, assumptions, and judgments before the situation is even clear. And once you see this pattern, you realize you don't have to follow it. You have the ability to step back, breathe, and let the moment show itself before deciding anything. Allowing is also the opposite of suppression. Suppression pushes feelings away. It hides emotions, avoids thoughts, and pretends everything is fine. But suppression always adds pressure. It does not create peace. Allowing, on the other hand, welcomes whatever arises without feeding it, fighting it, or turning it into more than it is. When you allow a feeling to exist without resistance, it naturally transforms. When you let thoughts appear without reacting, they lose their intensity. When you stop forcing yourself to be okay, you discover that calmness grows on its own. As you deepen this practice, you begin to trust the natural movement of your inner life. Fear rises and falls. Sadness softens. Anger loosens. Uncertainty shifts into clarity without being pushed. You learn that your inner world has its own intelligence, one that doesn't need your constant interference. You start to see that emotions are temporary movements, not problems that require immediate action. They are processes, not emergencies. Clarity comes when you stop crowding yourself with reactions. You begin to feel moments more honestly. Instead of turning pain into a story about what is wrong with you, you simply feel it. Instead of turning uncertainty into panic, you let it be what it is. Instead of spiraling into judgment, you stay open. Peace comes not from controlling your experience, but from allowing it to unfold without pressure. This shift also affects your relationships. You stop trying to fix people's emotions. You stop taking responsibility for how others feel or act. you stop forcing conversations, forcing solutions, forcing closeness, forcing understanding. Instead, you show up without pressure. You listen without planning. You care without carrying what is not yours. This brings relief to your heart and space to your relationships. Allowing also transforms your relationship with life itself. You stop believing everything depends on your force. You stop interpreting every change as danger. You stop demanding that life follow your plans. You learn to trust the unfolding even when you don't understand it. You learn that resistance often creates the very pain you're trying to escape. You learn that letting go of control allows life to reveal paths you couldn't have created on your own. This discipline teaches humility. You realize you don't always know what is best for you. Some of the things you once resisted became blessings. Some of the doors that closed protected you. Some of the discomforts shaped your strength. Some of the moments you feared carried hidden guidance. When you stop interfering, you let life show you possibilities that force and fear could never offer. Over time, allowing becomes inner strength. You respond instead of react. You breathe instead of tense. You witness instead of panic. You move through life with more ease, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer fighting every moment. You begin to experience peace in its true form, quiet, steady, and independent of circumstances. What once overwhelmed you now passes through you. What once felt intolerable now softens. What once felt chaotic now feels workable. Your mind learns to rest without being pushed. Your heart learns to open without being forced. Your inner world becomes a place where peace can grow naturally. This is the discipline of allowing, a gentle but powerful practice that loosens the grip of suffering and creates room for clarity, softness, and freedom to rise within you. Before moving forward, something inside you begins to shift again. A softer understanding rises from what you learned earlier. That peace grows when you stop interfering with every inner movement. Now there is a new question forming quietly within you. If I don't interfere with what I feel, then what am I supposed to do with my emotions? This question opens the door to a deeper truth, one that touches the core of Buddhist psychology. A truth that can feel almost shocking the first time you hear it. A truth that has the power to free you from years of emotional heaviness. And it begins with seeing emotions in a completely different way. Your journey continues here. There is a subtle but life-changing shift that happens when you stop calling every emotion mine. Most people spend their entire lives believing that every feeling that arises belongs to them. They say, my sadness, my anger, my fear, my anxiety, my insecurity. They treat emotions as personal possessions, as permanent parts of who they are. And the moment you call a feeling yours, you strengthen its hold. You turn a passing experience into an identity. You turn a temporary wave into a self-portrait. You begin to suffer not from the emotion itself, but from the belief that it defines you. Buddhist psychology teaches something radically different. It says, emotions do not belong to you. They arise, they pass through you, and they disappear, all on their own. You are the space they move through, not their owner. This is emotional non-ownership, the art of experiencing every emotion fully without claiming it as who you are. It begins with seeing emotions as events, not possessions. Just as a sound arises in the environment, an emotion arises in the mind. It has a cause, a lifespan, and an end. It comes into awareness, stays for a moment, and dissolves when its conditions fade. Nothing in it belongs to a self. Nothing in it is personal. Nothing in it says anything about your worth or identity. It is simply an experience moving through consciousness. But many people misunderstand this. They fear that not claiming emotions means running from them or suppressing them. Emotional non-ownership is the opposite. It allows you to feel more deeply, more honestly, more cleanly, without the extra weight of "this means something about me." When you feel sadness without calling it yours, the sadness becomes pure experience rather than a story. When you feel anger without claiming it, the anger loses its bite and reveals its underlying energy, unmet needs, boundaries, or old wounds seeking release. When fear arises without ownership, it becomes a signal rather than an identity. Emotional non-ownership also removes the shame people often attach to their feelings. When someone thinks, "I shouldn't feel this," or "I'm weak for feeling this," or "this emotion means something is wrong with me," they add layers of resistance that make the feeling harder to bear. But when you see a feeling simply as a temporary experience arising from certain causes, there is no shame. Rain is not shameful. Wind is not shameful. A passing cloud does not become a flaw in the sky. Just like that, an emotion is not a flaw in you. This shift also changes the way you relate to emotional intensity. When you see emotions as yours, you feel responsible for them. You feel the need to control them, fix them, hide them, or justify them. This makes emotions heavier, more complicated, more suffocating. But when you see them as temporary processes moving through the mind, you no longer feel responsible for controlling the entire storm. You simply allow the storm to pass while you remain steady in the awareness that observes it. Emotional non-ownership becomes even clearer when you look at how emotions arise. A feeling shows up because of a combination of conditions, past experiences, physical states, thoughts, memories, triggers, environmental cues, and unconscious patterns. These conditions come together, create an emotion, and then disperse. At no point does the emotion become a permanent part of you. It simply arises because the conditions support it. Understanding this removes the illusion of personal ownership. This practice also deepens your emotional intelligence. When you stop taking emotions personally, you can examine them without fear. You can ask, what conditions created this? What is this emotion trying to show me? What does this feeling need in order to pass? Instead of fighting with emotions, you study them. Instead of being overwhelmed, you become curious. Curiosity opens the door to insight. Insight opens the door to healing. Healing opens the door to inner freedom. There is another layer to emotional non-ownership, the layer of compassion. When you stop identifying with your emotions, you stop identifying with other people's emotions as well. You see that their anger, fear, or sadness also arises from conditions, not from their personal identity. This removes the tendency to take their feelings personally. You stop blaming them for having emotions, just as you stop blaming yourself. This creates healthier relationships, deeper understanding, and more space for genuine connection. This practice also dissolves emotional reactivity. When an emotion arises and you immediately call it mine, the mind automatically reacts. You brace yourself. You tighten your chest. You analyze, resist, or judge. But when you let the emotion arise without ownership, the reaction doesn't happen. The body relaxes. The mind stays open. The emotion has room to move without becoming entangled. This prevents small emotions from escalating into full emotional spirals. Emotional non-ownership also helps you experience the full truth of impermanence. When you stop claiming emotions, you see clearly how quickly they shift. You notice how sadness turns into calm, how anger turns into clarity, how fear turns into release. You begin to trust the natural rhythm of the mind. You no longer panic when emotions rise because you know they will fall. This trust transforms your inner world. Another part of this practice is learning to describe emotions without personal pronouns. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you say, "Anger is here." Instead of, "I am anxious," you say, "Anxiety is arising." This simple change loosens the mental glue that attaches you to the emotion. It shifts your awareness from identification to observation. It places you in the role of the witness rather than the character trapped in the emotional scene. This kind of language reshapes your inner landscape. It teaches you to relate to emotions as passing phenomena rather than defining qualities. It also helps you respond with more clarity. When you're not fused with an emotion, you can choose your response instead of being controlled by the feeling. This is emotional freedom, the ability to feel deeply without being trapped. Emotional non-ownership also opens the door to inner stillness. When emotions arise without resistance and dissolve without interference, the mind naturally settles. Stillness emerges not because emotions disappear, but because you stop clinging to them. The mind becomes like a clear sky where clouds pass but do not disturb the vastness. Stillness is not the absence of emotional weather. It is the freedom from identifying with the weather. This practice also helps you connect with a deeper sense of self. When emotions no longer define you, you begin to discover the part of you that does not change, the awareness that observes everything. This awareness is not disturbed by emotions. It is not threatened by fear or shaken by sadness. It is steady, spacious, and calm. Emotional non-ownership trains you to rest in this awareness, letting emotions come and go while you remain grounded. The practice becomes even more powerful when applied to difficult emotions. When grief arises without ownership, you can feel its depth without drowning. When anger arises without ownership, you can see its root without acting from it. When fear arises without ownership, you can observe its movement without shrinking. Difficult emotions lose their destructive power when they are no longer fused with the sense of self. This understanding also reveals how many emotional burdens you carry simply because you think they are yours. Some emotions belong to old memories. Some belong to wounds from childhood. Some belong to the echoes of other people's pain. Some belong to fears you inherited from past generations. Emotional non-ownership allows you to release burdens that never truly belonged to you. This practice also changes how you process emotional pain. Instead of wrestling with it, you allow it to pass through. Instead of holding it, you let it move. Instead of fearing it, you observe it. Pain still hurts, but it no longer destroys you. It becomes something the heart can hold without breaking. Over time, emotional non-ownership becomes a natural way of being. You start living with less emotional heaviness. You no longer cling to every inner movement. You no longer panic when feelings arise. You no longer define yourself by what you feel in one moment. Your emotions become like waves in a larger ocean, noticeable, real, but never capable of defining the vastness beneath them. And slowly, without forcing anything, you discover a profound truth. Emotions come, emotions go, and none of them have the power to tell you who you are. When you stop claiming them, they stop claiming you. Your path continues from here. You've just taken in the truth that emotions don't need to be owned to be fully felt, and something inside you begins to loosen even more. There is a sense of relief in knowing you don't have to carry every emotion as part of your identity. But as this relief grows, another question rises quietly inside you. If emotions aren't who I am, then why do they still feel so overwhelming? Why do certain thoughts keep pulling me into the same pain over and over? This curiosity opens the door to a deeper layer of understanding, a layer where the real source of suffering becomes clearer. Not the emotions themselves, but the stories your mind builds around them. Stories that feel real, sound convincing, and often run without your awareness. Stories that shape your perception long before you can question them. Here begins the next unfolding. The mind does not simply register experiences, it narrates them. It creates meaning, explanations, predictions, and assumptions. It strings together events into stories that feel like truth. This inner narrator appears so quickly and speaks with such confidence that you rarely notice what it's doing. A neutral moment becomes a personal attack. A delayed message becomes rejection. A simple mistake becomes failure. The narrator fills the unknown with fear, fills silence with assumptions, and fills uncertainty with distorted conclusions. Because the story sounds familiar, you believe it. One of the deepest illusions the mind creates is the illusion of certainty. The narrator fills gaps with interpretations to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. If someone is quiet, the narrator says they are upset with you. If a plan doesn't unfold as expected, it says something is wrong. If you feel anxiety, it claims something bad is coming. These stories are not facts. They are attempts to reduce uncertainty. But instead of protecting you, they trap you in a cycle of misinterpretation and fear. Most suffering comes not from reality, but from the stories added to it. Renouncing the inner narrator doesn't mean silencing the mind. You cannot shut it off. The mind will narrate. That is its nature. What changes is your relationship to the narration. You learn to see thoughts as thoughts, not as truth. You notice the story without surrendering to it. You feel the emotion without adding a narrative on top. This shift breaks the spell the inner narrator has held over you for years. The narrator thrives on identity. It always ties its stories back to the self. I'm not enough. People don't respect me. I always ruin things. Others are better than me. These lines sound like personal truths, but they are simply repeated narratives the mind has rehearsed for a long time. When you stop believing the narrator, these internal sentences lose their authority. They become background noise instead of defining truths. A key insight from Buddhist psychology is understanding that the mind is conditioned. Every story it creates comes from past experiences, old wounds, inherited fears, cultural expectations, and unconscious beliefs. It repeats patterns it learned long ago. When the narrator creates a story, it is rarely describing the present moment. It is echoing the past. This is why stories often feel familiar. They follow the same script, even when the situation is completely different. To renounce the narrator, you start by noticing its patterns. You notice when the mind jumps to conclusions. You notice when a situation triggers a repetitive storyline. You notice when thoughts feel rehearsed. You begin to sense the difference between direct experience and the interpretation added on top. Direct experience is always simple: a sound, a sensation, a feeling. The story is what complicates it. Observing this difference weakens the narrator's influence. Another powerful part of this practice is recognizing that the narrator often speaks in absolutes. It uses words like always, never, everyone, no one, because the mind loves dramatic certainty. But life rarely fits into absolutes. When you start questioning these thoughts, they lose their grip. You begin to see that the narrator is not describing life accurately. It is dramatizing it. Detaching from these exaggerations returns you to a more grounded understanding of what's happening. This practice also requires emotional honesty. When the narrator creates a story, it usually tries to protect you from discomfort. It builds stories to avoid vulnerability, fear, uncertainty, or emotional exposure. When you see this clearly, you respond with compassion instead of believing the narrative. You recognize that beneath every distorted story is an emotion that simply needs space. Instead of following the story, you turn toward the emotion and allow it to be felt. Without the story feeding it, the emotion softens on its own. Detaching from the narrator gives you the ability to pause. Before reacting, you notice the story forming. You see the mind beginning to dramatize, interpret, or predict. This pause gives you choice. The choice to respond consciously instead of reacting blindly. You begin to see how much of your past behavior was shaped not by truth, but by narrative. When this becomes clear, your actions become lighter and wiser. Renouncing the narrator also transforms the way you relate to conflict. When someone says or does something, the narrator quickly fills in motives, meaning, and conclusions. It assumes intentions. It interprets tone. It creates emotional meaning out of incomplete information. When you detach from these narratives, you stop taking things so personally. You stop projecting your fears into interactions. Communication becomes clearer because you are responding to the moment, not to the story created around it. Another powerful aspect of this practice is recognizing that the narrator often confuses thoughts with facts. A thought is simply a mental event, but the narrator presents it as undeniable reality. Detaching from the narrator means learning to see thoughts as passing mental activity. They arise, stay briefly, and pass when conditions change. When you stop attaching truth to these thoughts, you stop suffering from them. You realize you don't need to control or suppress them. You only need to stop believing everything they say. This practice opens the door to a deeper clarity. When you stop fusing thoughts with reality, the world becomes simpler. You begin to see things as they are, not as the mind dramatizes them to be. You experience life directly. You feel emotions without stories. You meet moments without past narratives shaping them. This kind of clarity brings a peace that cannot be shaken by the mind's constant storytelling. Renouncing the narrator also reveals a deeper spaciousness within you. Beneath the stories is a quiet awareness that doesn't judge, doesn't interpret, doesn't dramatize. This awareness simply observes. It allows experiences to arise and pass without forcing them into meaning. This awareness is your true refuge. It is the part of you untouched by the narrator's distortions. As you reconnect with this awareness, the narrator loses its power. Another important part of this practice is understanding that the narrator often reacts to uncertainty with fear. When you don't know what will happen, the mind creates stories to fill the gap. These stories are rarely kind. They replay worst-case scenarios, repeat old fears, and exaggerate the risks. Detaching from these stories gives you space to meet uncertainty with openness instead of fear. You learn to tolerate not knowing, which reduces anxiety and increases resilience. Renouncing the inner narrator also teaches you to live with more presence. When you're caught in stories, you live in the past or the future. You replay old wounds or imagine future problems. But when you detach from the narrative, you return to the present moment, the only place where peace exists. You begin to experience life directly instead of through the filter of thought. This presence becomes a source of calm that stays with you even during difficulty. The practice also helps free you from the emotional spirals created by narrative thinking. When you fuse emotion with story, the emotion grows stronger. When you feel sadness and add the story, "No one understands me," the sadness intensifies. When you feel fear and add the story, "Something terrible will happen," the fear grows. When you detach from the story, the emotion stays pure and manageable. You stop feeding the emotional fire with narrative fuel. Renouncing the narrator also supports healthier self-understanding. When you stop believing the narrator's negative stories, you stop defining yourself through them. You stop labeling yourself as broken, weak, flawed, or unworthy. You begin to see yourself more clearly as someone experiencing emotions, not someone defined by them. This creates a more grounded and compassionate relationship with yourself. As this practice deepens, you start noticing how often the narrator speaks from habit, not truth. The stories repeat themselves across different situations because they come from old mental patterns. When you detach from these patterns, you break cycles of suffering that have lasted for years. You start responding from a place of clarity rather than from old scripts. Another transformative part of this practice is learning to allow silence. The narrator fills silent moments with mental noise because it fears stillness. But when you welcome stillness, you weaken the narrator's influence. Silence becomes a space for insight rather than anxiety. Stillness becomes a source of strength rather than discomfort. When the narrator loses its grip, you discover a natural calm that has always been beneath the noise. Renouncing the narrator also gives you freedom from comparison. The inner storyteller constantly measures your life against others, their success, their relationships, their achievements. These comparisons create insecurity and dissatisfaction. When you detach from the narrator, you stop comparing. You begin to see your life as uniquely yours. You appreciate your path instead of measuring it against others. This brings a quiet contentment that comparison can never give. This practice also reveals how many of your fears are created by narrative, not reality. Fear often arises because the narrator imagines what could go wrong. These imagined outcomes feel real because the mind reacts to thoughts as if they were events. When you detach from these imagined stories, you stop living in fear. You begin responding to what is actually happening rather than to what your mind predicts. Over time, renouncing the narrator becomes a natural way of living. You speak differently to yourself. You see through your thoughts instead of being trapped in them. You understand your emotions without dramatizing them. You meet life with openness instead of fear. You notice the stories forming, but you do not enter them. You let them rise and fade without becoming their character. And slowly, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind still produces stories, but they no longer define your reality. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer control your choices. Narratives still appear, but they pass through you like shadows instead of storms. You discover that peace does not come from stopping thoughts. It comes from no longer believing every story your mind creates. This is the freedom that begins when you renounce the inner narrator. You've just seen how much of your suffering comes from the stories your mind creates, the way the inner narrator turns passing moments into heavy meanings. And now, something subtle begins to unfold within you. A quiet realization that if thoughts can be questioned, then maybe the one who believes them can also be questioned. A soft curiosity rises. If I'm not my emotions and I'm not my stories, then who exactly am I? This single question opens a doorway to a truth far deeper than anything explored so far. A truth that can free you from years of pressure, self-judgment, and the constant need to defend a fixed idea of who you are. This next step touches identity itself. Most people live with the belief that they are a single, solid, unchanging self. They say, "This is who I am," and cling to that statement as if it were permanent. They build their identity from old memories, past choices, mistakes, achievements, praise, criticism, habits, and roles. They call this whole collection me, and because they believe it is permanent, any threat to it feels dangerous. A negative comment becomes an attack on the core self. A change in circumstances feels like a loss of identity. A failure becomes a wound that goes deeper than the moment. This clinging to a fixed self creates endless suffering. Buddhist wisdom reveals something radically different. You are not one fixed self. You are many changing selves. Just as external things change, the internal sense of I also changes. The self you experience is fluid, shifting, and constantly recreated moment by moment. It isn't a single structure, but a moving pattern. This means there is nothing solid to defend, nothing permanent to protect, nothing fixed to cling to. Identity becomes flexible, not rigid. Understanding this brings a freedom that is hard to describe until it is felt. When you let go of the idea that you must always be one specific someone, you stop fearing change. You stop forcing consistency. You stop imprisoning yourself in roles you've outgrown. You stop judging yourself through old identities. You no longer measure yourself by who you used to be or who you think you must become. Instead, you meet each moment with the openness of someone who is allowed to evolve. This understanding begins with noticing how different your inner experience is from day to day. There are mornings when you feel confident and others when you feel small. Moments when you are patient and moments when you are irritated. Times when you feel clear and times when you feel confused. There is no single version of you that stays the same. Your thoughts shift, your emotions shift, your preferences shift, your perspective shifts. The only constant is change. When you cling to the idea of a fixed self, you create conflict. You expect yourself to be consistent, even though your mind, body, and emotions naturally change. You say, "I should always be strong. I must always be calm. I shouldn't feel this. I must stay the same." And these expectations become chains. But when you accept that you are many changing selves, you allow yourself to have different states without judgment. You allow yourself to outgrow old ways of being. You allow yourself to learn, adapt, and transform. This understanding also softens self-criticism. When you think you are one solid self, you interpret every mistake as proof that something is wrong with you. But when you see that the you who made the mistake was one temporary version among many, the mistake becomes simply part of a moment, not evidence of a flaw, not a permanent defect, just a passing expression of conditions. This brings compassion toward yourself and reduces the pressure to perform your identity perfectly. The impermanence of self becomes even clearer when you look at how identity is formed. Every version of you arises because of conditions: your environment, your mood, your memories, your physical state, your relationships, your fears, your hopes. When these conditions change, your sense of self changes with them. This means identity is not something you are. It is something that unfolds. It is not a fixed object. It is a moving process. Seeing this dissolves the illusion of a permanent I. A powerful part of this practice is recognizing how much of your suffering comes from trying to preserve an old identity. You may force yourself into roles you've outgrown because you fear disappointing others. You may cling to old versions of yourself because they feel familiar. You may resist change because it threatens the story you tell about who you are. But the truth is that holding on to outdated identities creates emotional weight. Letting them go creates space. As you deepen this understanding, you begin to see identity as something you can consciously release. You allow yourself to evolve. You allow yourself to become someone new in each moment. You allow the self to be fluid instead of rigid. This flexibility creates resilience. When life changes, you adjust. When challenges arise, you meet them with openness. When old patterns fade, you don't cling. When new qualities appear, you don't resist. You live with less fear because nothing within you needs to remain the same. Understanding the impermanence of self also transforms how you relate to others. You stop expecting them to remain fixed. You stop holding them to old versions of themselves. You stop judging them by who they used to be. You allow them to grow, to rise, to change direction. This deepens compassion and strengthens relationships because you no longer cling to limiting stories about who someone is supposed to be. This insight also brings freedom from defensiveness. When you no longer cling to a solid identity, criticism doesn't threaten you. You don't feel the need to argue, justify, or protect a fragile self-image. Instead, you hear feedback with openness. You draw wisdom from what is useful and let the rest fall away. You respond with clarity instead of insecurity. This quiet strength comes from not identifying with any single version of yourself. Another profound part of this practice is understanding that identity is not tied to your past. When you see the self as a changing process, you stop defining yourself by old wounds, past failures, or outdated memories. You stop letting your past selves decide your future. You stop carrying burdens that belong to a version of you that no longer exists. This releases enormous emotional weight. You begin to feel lighter because you are no longer dragging old identities into the present. As you explore this more deeply, you realize that you do not have to become someone. You are always becoming. Identity is not a destination. It is movement. It is flow. When you embrace this, change becomes less frightening and more natural. Growth becomes easier. You stop forcing yourself to fit into roles that shrink you. You stop pretending to be who you think others want you to be. You stop clinging to a fixed idea of yourself. You live with honesty, ease, and freedom. This practice also reveals how much potential exists within you. When you release fixed identity, you make room for qualities you haven't met yet, strengths you haven't expressed, possibilities you haven't lived, insights you haven't discovered. You open yourself to paths that a rigid identity would have blocked. The more you let go of the idea of a permanent self, the more spacious your inner life becomes. As this understanding continues to unfold, something remarkable happens. You begin to trust yourself in a deeper, more authentic way. Not because you cling to a stable identity, but because you learn to trust the process of becoming. You trust your ability to adapt. You trust your ability to let go. You trust your ability to meet each moment with presence. This kind of trust does not come from knowing who you are. It comes from knowing that you are not limited by any single version of yourself. Over time, the impermanence of self becomes a source of peace rather than fear. You stop forcing yourself into rigid expectations. You stop resisting growth. You stop fearing change. You begin to see life as a continuous unfolding and yourself as a participant in that unfolding. Nothing within you has to stay the same, and nothing needs to be defended. This freedom softens the mind and opens the heart. As you continue walking this path, every moment becomes an opportunity to become a more compassionate, aware, and open version of yourself. Not because you reinvent the self, but because you realize the self is always shifting. You move from a life of rigidity into a life of fluidity, from clinging into allowing, from defending into opening, from fixed identity into boundless possibility. And as this truth settles into you, you step naturally into the next layer of understanding, where desire itself is seen not as an enemy, but as another impermanent movement passing through the ever-changing self. You've just opened yourself to the truth that you are not one fixed self. And with that realization, something inside you becomes even lighter. There is a calmness that grows when you stop forcing yourself to stay the same, when you stop gripping old identities, when you finally understand that who you are is always shifting. But as this openness grows, another question rises naturally inside you. If I am always changing, then why do certain urges and cravings keep pulling me back into the same patterns? Why do I feel pushed by desires that I don't fully understand? This question signals the next step in your unfolding. You are ready to see craving in a completely new way, Craving is something most people fear or feel ashamed of. They treat it like a flaw, a weakness, a sign of failure. They believe they must crush it, deny it, fight it, or hide it. This reaction creates guilt and self-conflict. But craving is not a monster. It is a movement. It rises when conditions support it, stays as long as those conditions remain, and weakens when the conditions fade. Craving is simply an energetic pull, not a personal flaw. Understanding this changes everything. Craving feels powerful because people attach identity to it. They say, "I am weak, I can't control myself, I'm addicted to this, I should be stronger." These thoughts make craving heavier and more personal. When craving arises and you call it mine, you strengthen it. You fuse with it. You give it authority. But when craving is seen as a movement, not a self, it loses its hold. It becomes just another temporary experience passing through the mind. The first step is recognizing that craving is a natural part of being human. It arises because of conditioning. It responds to cues, memories, emotions, and learned associations. When you feel lonely, craving seeks comfort. When you feel stressed, craving seeks relief. When you feel bored, craving seeks stimulation. None of this is personal. It is simply the mind responding to discomfort. Seeing craving as a response rather than a defect softens the shame around it. A powerful shift happens when you stop fighting craving and begin observing it. Fighting craving often strengthens it. Resistance feeds it with emotional energy, but observing craving without judgment reveals its true nature. You notice how craving arises, peaks and fades. You notice that craving is strongest when you resist it and weakest when you allow it. This observation gives you freedom. You realize you do not have to obey craving or fear it. Craving is also misunderstood because people believe it always requires action. But craving does not demand action. It only presents sensation. When craving arises, it brings a feeling in the body, a pull in the chest, a tightness in the throat, a rush in the stomach. These sensations convince you that you must act. But when you learn to feel these sensations without moving, craving loses its urgency. Craving feeds on impulsive reaction. It dissolves in awareness. Another important part of understanding craving is seeing its impermanence. When craving appears, it feels like it will stay forever. But when observed closely, it rises, builds, and falls. There is always a peak, and after the peak, there is release. This cycle becomes clear when you stop acting automatically. When craving is observed without pressure, it shows itself as temporary rather than overwhelming. This alone changes your relationship to it entirely. Craving also becomes lighter when you understand its roots. Every craving has a reason. Sometimes craving arises from unmet emotional needs. Sometimes it comes from old habits that were formed long ago. Sometimes it is triggered by external conditions. When you look closely, craving reveals what the mind is seeking: comfort, distraction, pleasure, escape, connection, or release. Understanding the root softens the intensity. When you know why craving is here, it becomes easier to meet it without panic. This understanding also reveals that craving is not always harmful. Not all craving leads to suffering. Craving becomes harmful only when it turns into attachment. when you believe you cannot be okay without satisfying it. But craving itself is simply movement. It is neutral energy. It becomes harmful only when you grasp it. When you allow it to move without grasping, craving becomes harmless. A deep transformation occurs when you recognize craving as a signal, not a command. Craving is the mind's way of pointing toward something unresolved. When craving arises, instead of reacting, you ask yourself what experience you are avoiding. Many cravings hide fear, loneliness, insecurity, or exhaustion. When craving is treated as the problem, the real issue stays hidden. But when craving is treated as a messenger, healing becomes possible. You address the root instead of the symptom. Understanding craving as movement also removes the guilt attached to it. Many people feel ashamed when they experience desire, especially desires that contradict their ideals or standards. They judge themselves harshly and create emotional wounds. But when craving is seen as a natural movement, guilt loses its grip. You no longer shame yourself for being human. You stop turning craving into a moral failure. This releases a tremendous amount of emotional tension. Craving also becomes easier to work with when you stop identifying with it. Saying, "I want this," fuses you with the desire. Saying, "wanting is present," separates you from it. It moves craving from the center of your identity to the edge of awareness. You become the observer, not the one being pulled. This small linguistic shift has enormous psychological power. It weakens the connection between self and craving, making it easier to let the craving pass. Another layer of understanding comes from seeing that craving intensifies when you're disconnected from yourself. When you rest in awareness, craving is only a ripple. But when you are distracted, tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally depleted, craving becomes a wave. This means the key to handling craving is not discipline, but awareness. When you are grounded and present, craving does not dominate. It becomes a minor movement in a much larger space. Working with craving also requires softness. If you try to suppress craving with force, craving will return stronger. Suppression feeds desire by pushing it into the unconscious where it grows. Allowing craving to rise openly weakens it. Softness does not mean giving in, it means not fighting. It is a gentle presence that makes craving transparent instead of solid. This transparency reveals that craving is not a monster. It is a movement of energy. Craving also loses power when you stop telling stories about it. The narrator often adds meaning to craving. "If I don't satisfy this, I'll be miserable." This craving proves something is wrong with me. I can't live without this. These stories intensify the craving. They turn it into a threat. They turn a simple sensation into a narrative of failure. When you drop the stories and feel only the raw sensation, craving becomes manageable. It is sensations, not stories, that dissolve. Understanding craving as movement also teaches patience. You learn to ride the wave instead of fighting it. When craving peaks, you stay steady. When it softens, you breathe. This patience builds inner strength. You learn that you can endure discomfort without collapse. You realize that craving is not stronger than you. It only feels strong because of your reaction to it. Patience reveals your resilience. Another important part of this practice is reconnecting with your body. Craving often pulls you into the mind, but the actual experience of craving lives in the body. tension, tingling, restlessness, pressure. When you bring attention to the body, craving loses its mystery. It becomes physical rather than psychological. You feel it directly instead of thinking about it. This direct contact immediately weakens craving's emotional power. Craving also softens when you offer yourself what craving is actually asking for. Sometimes craving arises because you need rest, affection, grounding, expression, or nourishment. When you take care of yourself, craving reduces. When needs are ignored, craving increases. Understanding this helps you respond intelligently rather than impulsively. You meet the underlying need instead of reacting to the surface desire. This creates lasting change. Seeing craving as movement allows you to live with desire without fear. You stop feeling controlled by it. You stop seeing it as a threat. You stop believing it defines your character. Craving becomes something you can meet with curiosity rather than panic. This creates inner peace. You are no longer pulled by urges or shamed by them. You become free from the cycle of indulgence and suppression. Over time, this practice transforms your entire emotional landscape. You become someone who remains steady even when desire rises. You become someone who sees craving clearly rather than reacting impulsively. You become someone who can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. You become someone who trusts that every movement in the mind will pass. And as craving loses its power, your clarity grows. Craving moves. Craving shifts. Craving dissolves. It was never a monster. It was only energy passing through. Seeing it this way frees you from guilt, resistance, and inner conflict. It allows you to meet desire with wisdom instead of fear. And from here, you are ready to move even deeper, into learning how to love without clinging, to care without grasping, and to remain open without losing yourself. You've just seen craving for what it truly is. Not a threat, not a flaw, but a passing current that gains power only when you resist it or call it your identity. That realization already softens something deep inside you. But as that softness spreads, another truth begins to surface. Many of the deepest cravings you've ever felt were connected to love. The craving to be wanted, the craving to be understood, the craving to hold on to someone, the craving to never be left behind. Something inside you quietly asks, if craving is just movement, then what about love? Why does love feel so heavy, so gripping, so full of fear? This question opens the door to one of the most misunderstood aspects of human experience: how to love without clinging. Love, in its pure form, is a spacious feeling. It allows, accepts, supports, and uplifts. But most people never experience it that way because they wrap love in fear. They think love must involve holding tightly. They confuse affection with possession. They believe closeness means merging, controlling, securing, or guaranteeing. They measure love by how much someone gives them, how much they stay, how much they meet expectations. These ideas turn love into a cage, not a gift. Clinging arises from fear. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of uncertainty, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. When fear mixes with affection, it creates attachment. Attachment is the belief that love must stay, that the person must behave a certain way, that closeness must be controlled. This attachment creates suffering for both people involved. The lover feels anxious and the loved feels pressured. Love becomes heavy instead of freeing. The first step toward loving without clinging is recognizing that people do not belong to you. Their thoughts are not yours to shape. Their choices are not yours to control. Their path is not yours to direct. When you treat someone like part of your identity, you start trying to manage them. You expect them to fulfill your needs, soothe your fears, fix your insecurities, or validate your worth. But these expectations choke love. They turn affection into duty. They make the relationship fragile and tense. Loving without clinging means loving someone as they are, not as you want them to be. It means giving them space to breathe, space to grow, space to change. It means releasing the need to control their feelings or predict their actions. It means trusting them to walk with you freely, not because they are bound, but because they choose to be there. This kind of love feels different. It feels calm instead of desperate. It feels expanding instead of squeezing. It feels like two people standing side by side rather than tangled together. This practice begins by looking at the fears beneath attachment. When you cling, it is because something inside you does not feel steady. You fear being alone with yourself. You fear facing your own emptiness. You fear losing someone because you believe losing them means losing part of your worth. But when you understand that love is not supposed to complete you, clinging weakens. Love is meant to flow, not plug a hole. When you strengthen your inner stability, you stop grasping others as emotional anchors. Loving without clinging also requires honesty about the difference between love and attachment. Love says, "I care for you deeply." Attachment says, "I need you to stay because I'm scared without you." Love says, "I want to understand you." Attachment says, "I want you to act the way I expect." Love says, "I want you to be free." Attachment says, "Your freedom threatens me." When you see this difference clearly, you begin to release the grip that attachment places on your relationships. A powerful shift comes when you stop treating relationships as guarantees. People change, circumstances change, life changes. When you cling to the illusion of permanence, you create fear. But when you accept impermanence, something surprising happens. You love more deeply. You appreciate moments instead of taking them for granted. You pay attention instead of assuming tomorrow will be the same. You hold people gently instead of gripping them tightly. Impermanence does not weaken love. It intensifies it with presence. Loving without clinging also means letting others have their emotional reality. You stop demanding that they feel a certain way. You stop expecting them to react exactly how you want. You stop trying to shape their inner world. Instead, you accept that they have their own experiences, fears, desires, wounds, and hopes. This acceptance creates emotional maturity. It frees both of you from trying to control each other's inner landscape. It creates connection through acceptance, not through pressure. Another part of loving without clinging is learning to listen without trying to solve. When you cling, you listen in order to protect your fears. You listen to find reassurance. You listen to confirm your expectations. But loving without clinging means listening to understand, listening to connect, listening without filtering everything through your insecurities. This kind of listening allows love to breathe. It creates safety for both people. A deep misunderstanding about love is the belief that closeness means merging identities. But merging creates confusion, resentment, and dependency. When two people lose themselves trying to become one, the relationship becomes imbalanced. Loving without clinging means staying connected but not fused. It means valuing your own identity while respecting theirs. It means sharing life without collapsing into each other. Healthy love has space. This practice also dissolves jealousy. Jealousy is the fear that someone else can take what you cling to. But when you love without possession, jealousy loses its foundation. You do not view love as scarce. You do not view attention as currency. You do not view connection as ownership. You understand that love is not taken away by others, it only changes form. When you stop possessing, you stop fearing loss, and this brings peace. Loving without clinging also brings clarity about responsibility. You stop expecting others to fix your inner wounds. You stop demanding emotional rescue. You stop outsourcing your healing. Instead, you take responsibility for soothing your own fears, regulating your emotions, and strengthening your inner world. This reduces pressure on relationships. It makes love more balanced and respectful. Another insight arises when you see that clinging does not protect love. It suffocates it. When you grip someone tightly, you create resistance. The more you push, the more they feel the need to pull back. The more you cling, the more fear grows between you. But when you loosen your grip, something beautiful happens. Love becomes a choice again, not an obligation. People stay because they feel safe, not because they feel trapped. This practice also shows you the beauty of emotional independence. Emotional independence does not mean isolation or coldness. It means your emotional stability does not crumble when someone else changes, disappoints you, or walks away. It means you can care deeply without collapsing. It means you love fully while remaining whole. This kind of strength makes love healthier and more lasting. Loving without clinging reveals the difference between connection and dependence. Connection enriches your life. Dependence drains it. Connection grows with openness. Dependence grows with fear. When you understand this difference, you start choosing relationships based on genuine connection rather than emotional survival. This path also teaches you to love with presence instead of projection. When you cling, you project fears, hopes, fantasies, and insecurities onto the relationship. You stop seeing the real person. You see only the image that supports your emotional needs. But loving without clinging means seeing the other person clearly, their strengths, flaws, dreams, and limits. This clarity creates real intimacy instead of illusion. As you deepen this understanding, something transforms within you. You stop trying to hold love. You stop trying to freeze it. You stop trying to force it into permanence. You allow love to flow. You allow it to grow. You allow it to change. And in this allowing, love becomes more stable because it is no longer built on fear. When love stops being a cage, it becomes a space for both people to expand. When love stops being possession, it becomes freedom. When love stops being clinging, it becomes compassion. Loving without clinging does not weaken connection. It strengthens it. It frees both hearts. It creates a relationship built on presence, honesty, and mutual respect. And with your heart now opening in a new way, the next teaching naturally calls to you, the practice of returning with gentleness, so the mind learns to come back without fear or punishment. The moment you understand love without clinging, something inside you becomes calmer. Your grip loosens, your heart feels less threatened. But as that clarity settles, you notice another pattern quietly unfolding within you. No matter how much wisdom you gather, the mind still drifts. It wanders into fear, into old habits, into daydreams, into memories, into worries. And then a subtle frustration appears. Why can't I stay centered? Why do I keep slipping back into old patterns? This frustration creates inner tension, but that tension reveals the next step. You are now ready to learn the practice that holds all others together, the art of returning with gentleness. Many people believe that a disciplined mind is one that never wanders. They think focus means perfection, that presence means constant control. So when their mind drifts, they judge themselves harshly. They criticize their lack of discipline. They punish themselves for being distracted. They believe they have failed simply because they left the moment. This self-criticism is more damaging than the drifting itself. The mind does not break because it wandered. It breaks because of the attack that follows. The truth is simple. Every mind wanders. The mind is movement by nature. It explores, seeks, imagines, remembers, fears, plans, and reacts. It is constantly shifting. The problem is not that you drift. The problem is the harshness you meet yourself with when you notice the drift. That harshness tightens the mind and creates resistance. That resistance makes presence feel difficult. That difficulty turns into discouragement, and discouragement becomes a barrier to growth. The practice of returning teaches something revolutionary. The return is more important than the wandering. When your mind drifts, the way you bring it back determines whether you build peace or tension. If you return with anger, you build shame. If you return with judgment, you build fear. If you return with disappointment, you build anxiety. But if you return with gentleness, the mind learns safety. It learns trust. It learns openness. Gentleness is the key. When you notice the mind drifting, you simply acknowledge it with a soft awareness, like recognizing a friend turning their head. You guide it back without punishment. You return to the breath, to the moment, to the task, to your center. The return becomes an act of compassion rather than correction. This approach rewires the mind. It teaches that presence is not an obligation, but a place of rest. When the return is gentle, the mind becomes more willing to come back. It stops fearing your response. It stops resisting the practice. It stops hiding behind distraction. The mind opens because it feels safe. This safety creates stability. Stability creates clarity. Clarity creates calm. The entire inner world becomes softer because you stopped waging war with your own thoughts. The practice of returning also teaches patience. You stop expecting instant mastery. You stop demanding perfection. You accept that presence is a practice, not a fixed state. You stop trying to freeze the mind into stillness. Instead, You allow the natural cycle, drifting and returning, drifting and returning. This cycle is the essence of training. Muscles strengthen through repetition. The mind strengthens through gentle returning. A powerful shift occurs when you stop seeing the drift as failure and start seeing the return as success. Every return is an act of awareness. Every return is a moment of awakening. Every return strengthens your capacity for presence. Instead of spiraling into frustration, you begin to celebrate every return. This transforms your relationship with your inner world. Returning with gentleness also reduces emotional suffering. When you attack yourself for drifting, you activate the same patterns that create anxiety, shame, and self-doubt. But when you return with care, you soothe those patterns. You train your mind to relax instead of tense. This relaxation spreads through your emotions. It makes you softer with yourself. It makes you less reactive. It cultivates inner peace. The practice of returning is also an act of humility. It reminds you that you are human, that the mind is not a machine, and that wisdom grows slowly, organically. You stop demanding superhuman focus. You accept your nature without frustration. This acceptance opens the door to deeper self-understanding. You begin to see the patterns behind your drifting, the fears, the habits, the memories, the unresolved emotions. And because you no longer judge yourself, you can explore these patterns with honesty. Returning also builds inner strength because it teaches endurance. Even when your mind wanders 1,000 times, you return 1,000 times. You do not quit. You do not give up. You do not shame yourself. You simply come back again. This persistence creates resilience. You learn that drifting does not remove your ability to return. You learn that the mind's chaos cannot destroy your capacity for calm. This knowledge creates confidence. The practice deepens when you start noticing the patterns of your drifting without reacting to them. You notice the kind of thoughts that pull you away. You notice the emotional states that distract you. You notice the moments when your attention weakens. This awareness helps you understand yourself more deeply. You begin to see not only that you drift, but why you drift. This is insight, and insight is healing. Gentle returning also trains the mind to let go more easily. When you bring yourself back without punishment, you learn that you can release a thought without fighting it. You can let go of stories without believing them. You can release emotional spirals before they grow. This makes detachment a natural skill rather than a forced effort. Another important part of this practice is compassion. When you return gently to yourself, you practice the same compassion you wish to offer others. You learn how to be kind even when you are imperfect. You learn how to forgive small mistakes instantly. You learn how to stay present with yourself even when your mind is restless. This compassion expands into your external life. You become more patient with others. You become less reactive in relationships. You become softer in your judgments. Gentleness toward yourself becomes gentleness toward the world. The practice of returning is also deeply grounding. Every return reconnects you with your breath, your body, and the present moment. These returns anchor you in reality instead of losing yourself in mental noise. Over time, the body becomes the home you return to. The breath becomes the stabilizing force. The present moment becomes your refuge. Consistency is the heart of this practice. Not perfection, not control, not force, just consistency. The willingness to come back again and again. The willingness to meet yourself where you are. The willingness to continue even when your mind feels wild. This consistency slowly transforms the mind from restless to steady, and something remarkable begins to happen when you practice returning regularly. The mind drifts less. Not because you force it, but because it trusts the space you have created. Presence becomes easier. Thoughts lose their urgency. Inner storms lose their force. Calm becomes a natural baseline rather than a rare experience. Returning becomes smoother, quieter, gentler. This is the power of the practice. Every gentle return brings you closer to yourself. Every return softens old wounds. Every return strengthens awareness. Every return deepens presence. And eventually, returning becomes your inner compass. It guides you through difficulty. It anchors you in uncertainty. It brings you back to the ground of your being. From here, you step naturally into the next teaching, the art of releasing hidden agendas, those subtle expectations that quietly shape your choices and disturb your peace. As you learn the practice of returning with gentleness, something important becomes clear. The mind settles not through force, but through softness. You begin to see that peace grows when you stop punishing yourself for drifting. This realization brings a sweetness to your inner world. But as that peace expands, another truth quietly rises to the surface. Even when you return gently, there is often a hidden expectation beneath your actions. A quiet whisper inside you saying, "I hope this works. I hope they appreciate this. I hope this turns out the way I want." These subtle agendas feel harmless, but they shape your emotional world far more than you notice. This next step takes you into the roots of these hidden expectations. There is a quiet pressure behind many of your actions, even the simple ones. You offer kindness, hoping others will respond warmly. You work hard, hoping your efforts will be seen. You make choices, hoping they will lead to success. You speak honestly, hoping to be understood. You give your time, hoping it will be valued. These hopes are not wrong, but when they go unnoticed, they become the source of deep disappointment. The mind constantly tries to predict outcomes and secure comfort. It attaches expectations to almost everything, even without your awareness. You may think you are acting freely, but underneath, there is a small agenda directing your emotions. When reality doesn't match that hidden agenda, suffering appears. You feel frustration, sadness, resentment, or confusion, not because the situation harmed you, but because the outcome did not meet the silent expectation you never admitted you had. The first step in releasing agendas is recognizing how subtle they can be. They often hide in good intentions. You help others hoping to be seen as kind. You give advice hoping to be respected. You stay quiet, hoping to avoid conflict. You speak up, hoping to be heard. You apologize, hoping to keep peace. These silent hopes influence your emotional reactions. When the outcome aligns with your hope, you feel relieved. When it doesn't, you feel hurt. This creates emotional instability because your inner peace becomes dependent on things you cannot control. Seeing this clearly softens the power agendas have over you. When you bring awareness to the hopes behind your actions, something opens. You begin to see how much your peace has been tied to external responses. You realize how often you have acted not from freedom, but from quiet desire. This recognition is not meant to create guilt, but clarity. You cannot release what you cannot see. Awareness is the beginning of liberation. Another part of releasing agendas is understanding that expectations are often based on the illusion of control. The mind believes that if it expects something strongly enough, reality will follow the expectation. But life does not bend to internal wishes. People act from their own conditions. Circumstances unfold according to their own nature. When you expect others to respond a certain way, you try to bend life into your preferred shape. And this creates tension because life moves according to its own laws. Letting go of these subtle expectations is not the same as not caring. It does not mean you become indifferent, numb, or detached in a cold way. It means your care becomes unconditional. You act from sincerity rather than strategy. You give without trying to control the return. You speak truth without insisting on a certain reaction. You love without demanding reassurance. You show up without needing the world to match your inner script. When you act without agendas, your heart becomes lighter. You no longer feel owed. You no longer feel betrayed when someone does not respond as you hoped. You no longer cling to outcomes. You no longer measure your worth by external responses. Every action becomes complete in itself. You feel free because you stop tying the value of your actions to what comes after them. Releasing the agenda also dissolves resentment. Resentment grows when you give with expectation. You may not say it out loud, but a quiet voice inside says, "I did this for you. Now you should do something for me." When this silent contract is not fulfilled, bitterness grows. When you let go of agendas, there is no contract. There is nothing to be violated. You act from clarity rather than transaction. This preserves your peace. Another insight comes from seeing how agendas distort perception. When you hope for a specific outcome, you filter everything through that hope. You read too much into small gestures. You interpret neutral actions through bias. You miss the reality because you are focused on what you want reality to be. Letting go of agendas allows you to see situations as they are, not as you wish them to be. This clarity brings emotional stability. Releasing hidden expectations also brings greater self-honesty. You start noticing the fears beneath your agendas. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of not being valued, fear of losing control. When you see these fears clearly, you stop projecting them onto your actions. You begin to soothe the fears directly instead of using expectations to temporarily mask them. This deepens emotional maturity. This practice is not about suppressing desire. It is about loosening the grip of neediness. Desire can exist without demand. You can hope without insisting. You can care without clinging. This creates a beautiful balance. You stay open to outcomes without being controlled by them. You take action without attaching your emotional well-being to the results. A major transformation happens when you learn to appreciate effort simply because it aligns with your values, not because you hope it will lead somewhere. When you act because the action itself is true to you, you stop chasing approval. You stop living for validation. You stop molding yourself to meet expectations. You start experiencing a kind of freedom where your actions feel clean, your intentions feel honest, and your peace feels stable. Releasing agendas also improves relationships. When you interact without hidden hopes, people feel safer around you. They do not sense pressure. They do not sense manipulation. They do not sense emotional contracts. Your presence becomes calming because it is free from demand. This creates healthier connections built on trust and authenticity. This practice softens emotional reactions too. When you have no agenda, disappointment becomes lighter. You do not collapse emotionally when life moves differently than you expected. You simply adjust. You observe. You accept. You adapt. This adaptability creates resilience. You discover that peace is not fragile, it is flexible. Over time, releasing hidden expectations becomes a natural way of living. You begin noticing agendas the moment they arise. You feel the tightness they create. You feel the pressure they add. You feel the subtle fear beneath them. And from that awareness, you release them before they take over. You return to sincerity, openness, and acceptance. And when you act without agendas, something inside you relaxes at a deeper level. You stop living in a constant emotional negotiation. You stop bargaining with reality. You stop tying your worth to outcomes. You begin experiencing moments directly. You begin acting from clarity rather than fear. You begin living from authenticity rather than expectation. This shift brings you closer to a profound freedom. The freedom to meet life without burdening it with conditions. And with this freedom taking shape inside you, you are now ready to explore a deeper illusion the mind holds. The belief that peace exists somewhere else, somewhere later, somewhere perfect, instead of in the unpolished moment right in front of you. You've just seen how releasing hidden agendas frees you from disappointment, pressure, and emotional negotiation. Something inside you softens when you act without needing a specific outcome. Your actions become cleaner. Your heart becomes lighter. But as this clarity settles, another quiet realization rises to the surface. Even when you drop expectations, there is still a deeper longing beneath everything you do. A longing for a moment where everything finally feels right. A moment where you finally arrive. A moment where life stops shifting, where your mind stops searching, where you finally feel done. This longing is subtle, but it shapes almost every choice you make. You are ready now to see it clearly. There is a powerful illusion woven into the human mind. The belief that peace exists somewhere else. Somewhere in the future. Somewhere after the next achievement. Somewhere once you're healed. Somewhere once you're successful. Somewhere once you're loved enough, strong enough, wise enough, calm enough. You carry the feeling that life will truly begin only when you reach some perfect state. This illusion keeps you running even when you want to rest. The mind constantly tells you that the next moment is more important than this one. It says you will feel better when you finally fix yourself, when the situation settles, when others behave differently, when you make progress, when your emotions calm down, when you gain more clarity. This belief keeps you living in a constant state of almost arriving, but not quite. You are always close, but never home. This mindset creates endless tension. You feel behind. You feel incomplete. You feel like you are missing something essential. You feel like you must keep striving, improving, achieving, adjusting, and becoming. You start treating your own life like a project. You wait for stability instead of living now. You wait for healing instead of allowing the moment to hold you as you are. You wait for peace instead of noticing it in small pieces already present. The wisdom of non-arrival reveals something different. There is nowhere to arrive. There is no final version of you waiting in the future. There is no perfect state where everything stays stable. There is no moment where life stops changing. Peace does not come from reaching a flawless condition. Peace comes from releasing the belief that you must become someone else in order to rest. This understanding begins by noticing how often you postpone your own peace. You think, "I'll feel okay once this problem is solved," but when that problem fades, another appears. You think, "I'll feel confident once I achieve this," but once you do, the goal shifts. You think, "I'll feel calm once my mind stops wandering." But the mind wanders again. The goal line moves endlessly because the problem is not the present. It is the belief that the present is not enough. Non-arrival invites you to stop chasing a perfect moment and start living inside the imperfect one you're already in. You stop waiting for conditions to match your desires. You stop basing your peace on future outcomes. You stop believing life owes you a perfect version of reality. You begin to accept that this moment, with its messiness, its beauty, its uncertainty, its discomfort, its complexity, is enough to be lived fully. This practice also transforms how you view personal growth. Instead of treating growth as a ladder you must climb toward some final state, you see it as a continuous unfolding. There is no finished. There is only learning. There is only deepening. There is only expanding awareness. When you release the fantasy of arrival, growth becomes gentle rather than urgent. You no longer feel pressured to hurry. You no longer measure yourself by milestones. You no longer panic when change is slow. You simply walk. The illusion of arrival is often tied to the belief that you are not enough yet. And because you don't feel enough, you keep striving for some future moment where you hope to finally feel whole. But non-arrival shows you that wholeness is already present, not because you are perfect, but because you are alive, aware, and connected to experience. Wholeness comes from presence, not from accomplishment. This insight also releases the anxiety around self-improvement. When you believe there is a perfect state waiting ahead, self-improvement becomes a burden. You judge yourself harshly. You compare yourself to others. You fear falling behind. But when you understand that there is no final version of you that must be reached, growth becomes naturally motivated. You improve not to arrive somewhere, but because growth itself feels meaningful. The wisdom of non-arrival also dissolves the pressure to fix everything immediately. You stop rushing. You stop grasping for solutions. You stop believing that peace depends on finishing your inner work. You realize that inner work is not a race. It is a lifelong relationship with yourself. You allow healing to unfold slowly. You allow clarity to come in waves. You allow yourself to rest even while unfinished. This gentle approach creates more transformation than pressure ever could. Another important part of this teaching is recognizing how often you try to escape the present moment because it feels imperfect. You escape through distraction, fantasizing, worrying, planning, scrolling, overworking, or self-criticism. These behaviors come from the belief that the future holds something better. But when you stop running toward a future moment, you begin to meet the present with honesty. You feel its textures. You witness its emotional truth. You engage with life more directly. Non-arrival is not about giving up on aspirations. It is about removing desperation from them. You still grow, but you do not believe growth will save you. You still dream, but you do not abandon your peace while chasing those dreams. You still improve, but you do not punish yourself for being in the process. This balance creates grounded progress. You evolve without abandoning yourself. This practice also reveals how deeply conditioned the mind is to seek completion. From childhood, you are taught that life is a series of achievements. Finish school, get the job, find the partner, succeed, settle down, retire. This pattern trains you to believe that life is always somewhere ahead of you. Non-arrival breaks this conditioning. It teaches that life is not a checklist. It is an ongoing experience. You stop living for later and start living for now. One of the most freeing parts of this teaching is understanding that imperfection is not a barrier to peace. It is the environment where peace grows. When you stop demanding perfection, you start seeing beauty in small things. A moment of quiet, a breath that grounds you, a smile that softens your chest, a single step toward clarity. Peace becomes accessible because it stops being conditional. This practice also teaches you to trust your path. When you release the fantasy of arrival, you stop comparing your journey to others. You stop worrying about being ahead or behind. You stop measuring your worth through progress. You see that your path unfolds uniquely. You take each step without needing to control the future. This trust deepens your connection to life itself. Non-arrival also brings emotional freedom. When you stop waiting for the perfect emotional state, you allow yourself to feel whatever arises. You accept sadness without thinking it means you're failing. You allow fear without believing it means you're broken. You hold joy without fearing it will disappear. You experience emotions as natural movements rather than signs of progress or decline. The wisdom of non-arrival teaches that peace is found in the rawness of the present, messy, unfinished, and deeply alive. You stop postponing your life. You stop postponing your healing. You stop postponing your peace. You begin to rest inside the unpolished moment. And when you rest in the present, you discover that the freedom you were chasing was always here, waiting for you to stop running. As this truth begins to settle into your awareness, you naturally move toward the next teaching, learning how to release tension stored not in the mind, but in the body, where much of your attachment silently lives. You've just stepped into the truth that there is nowhere to arrive, and something inside you softens deeply. The pressure to become someone fades. The urgency to perfect yourself loosens. There is a quiet peace in knowing you don't have to reach a flawless state to rest. But as the mind relaxes, another layer of understanding arises. Even when your thoughts let go, your body often does not. You notice the tight jaw, the lifted shoulders, the shallow breath, the clenched belly. You sense that some part of you is still holding on. This subtle tension reveals something important. The body often clings long after the mind understands release. And now you are ready to explore the next doorway, letting go through the body. Most people try to let go only through thinking, They try to talk themselves into calmness, reason themselves out of fear, or repeat ideas about acceptance, but the body holds its own history. Muscle memory stores past reactions, old traumas, unresolved emotions, and habitual tension. Even when your mind is willing to release, your body may still be gripping. Real detachment requires working with both the mind and the body because they influence each other constantly. Somatic detachment begins with noticing the micro-tensions you normally ignore. These small contractions are signs of holding fear, holding expectation, holding roles, holding stories, holding defenses. Tension is not random. It is the body's attempt to feel safe. When you become aware of these micro-tensions, you begin to understand how your body has been trying to protect you. Awareness is the first step toward release. Often the body tenses before the mind even forms a thought. Your shoulders rise when you feel uncertain. Your stomach tightens when you feel judged. Your throat constricts when you fear speaking. Your breath becomes shallow when you feel overwhelmed. These reactions happen so quickly that you miss the moment they begin. But when you slow down and observe your body with patience, you start to see patterns. You realize tension is not only physical, it is emotional memory expressed in muscle and breath. Letting go through the body starts with posture. The way you stand, sit, or carry yourself reflects your internal state. A closed posture signals protection. A rigid posture signals control. A collapsed posture signals defeat. None of these are conscious choices. They are conditioned responses. When you gently adjust your posture, opening the chest, relaxing the shoulders, softening the jaw, you send a signal to the nervous system that it can stop bracing. Your body begins to trust the environment again. This trust allows tension to release. Breath is another doorway into somatic detachment. Breath responds instantly to emotion. When you're stressed, breath becomes shallow. When you're anxious, it becomes tight. When you're afraid, it pauses. Learning to notice your breath shows you where your body is holding. Instead of trying to control the breath, the practice is to observe it, to watch how it moves, how it expands, how it contracts. This observation shifts you from autopilot to awareness. Slowly, the breath deepens on its own. The body lets go because you stopped interfering. Micro-tension awareness is a powerful tool. Instead of waiting for a large emotional reaction, you notice the small signs. The slight frown, the tightening around the eyes, the clenching of fingers, the curling of toes, the stiffening of the neck. These tiny contractions reveal where attachment lives. When you notice them early, you can soften before the emotion grows. This prevents emotional spirals and reduces stress before it builds. Letting go through the body also requires patience. Physical habits formed over years do not dissolve instantly. You are not trying to force relaxation. You are building a relationship with your body. You listen to its signals, respond with kindness, and offer it space. The body learns to release through safety, not pressure. When you show it that it doesn't need to brace for danger, it begins to let go naturally. This process is slow but deeply transformative. Another part of somatic detachment is learning to feel sensations without reacting. When tension arises, most people immediately try to fix it, stretching, forcing relaxation, distracting themselves. But true release comes from feeling the sensation fully without resistance. You observe the tightness, the heat, the contraction. You let it exist. When you stop fighting the tension, the body stops amplifying it. Sensation completes its cycle and dissolves. This practice also strengthens your ability to stay present. The body only exists in the now. When you observe your physical sensations, you return to the present moment. You stop drifting into stories or worries. You become grounded in the physical reality of your experience. This grounding stabilizes the mind and reduces emotional intensity. Detachment becomes easier because you are not lost in mental narratives. You are anchored in the body's truth. Somatic detachment also allows you to access emotions stored deeply within. Sometimes the body holds emotions that the mind has pushed away. When you soften tension, these emotions rise to the surface: sadness, fear, frustration, or vulnerability. Meeting these emotions without resistance allows them to release. The body lets go of what it has carried for years. You feel lighter, not because you talked through the emotion, but because your body finally released it. Working with the body also changes how you respond to stress. Instead of tightening, you learn to soften. Instead of bracing, you breathe. Instead of collapsing, you ground your feet. These small adjustments create resilience. You stop letting stress control your physical state. You meet challenging moments with presence rather than reactivity. This is somatic wisdom, the ability to remain steady through physical awareness. Another powerful aspect of this practice is understanding that the body communicates before the mind interprets. If you learn to listen to the body's signals early, you prevent emotional overwhelm. You notice when anxiety is starting instead of when it peaks. You notice when sadness is building instead of drowning in it. You notice when frustration is rising before it becomes anger. This early awareness allows you to respond with clarity. Somatic detachment also brings you closer to yourself. When you observe your body with kindness, you develop intimacy with your inner world. You feel connected to yourself rather than distant. You understand what your body needs. You understand what it fears. You understand how it protects you. This connection brings a softness that spreads through your entire being. As this practice deepens, you begin to notice how physical release impacts your emotional state. A relaxed jaw softens anger. A deep breath calms fear. An open posture reduces insecurity. Tension held in the body often amplifies emotional difficulty. When the body releases that tension, emotional clarity follows. This connection makes it easier to meet life without gripping. Letting go through the body also teaches you humility. You realize that many reactions are unconscious and automatic. You understand that your body holds old stories you didn't choose. This reduces self-judgment. You stop blaming yourself for tension. You begin to see your body as a partner rather than an obstacle. This compassion accelerates healing. In time, your body learns the feeling of release. It becomes familiar with softness. It recognizes safety. Tension becomes easier to notice and easier to let go of. Your entire physical system shifts from survival mode to presence. This creates a foundation for deeper psychological and spiritual detachment. As the body relaxes, the mind follows. Thought loops weaken. Emotional storms calm. Inner pressure dissolves. You begin to experience a quiet peace that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. And from this grounded state, you move toward the next teaching, how loss, instead of emptying you, can open space within you that you never knew existed. As the body learns to release its hidden tension, something inside you becomes steady in a new way. Your breath moves more freely, your posture softens, your inner world feels less crowded by old reactions. But with this new spaciousness comes an unexpected awareness. Space often feels frightening at first. When the body lets go, it creates openings, and openings remind you of loss. They remind you of moments when someone left, when something ended, when life changed without your permission. You may notice a subtle fear rising. What will fill this empty space? What if letting go leaves me with nothing? This fear is natural, and it signals the next teaching. Understanding loss in a deeper, more compassionate way. Most people view loss as emptiness, a void that takes something essential away. Whether it is the loss of a person, a relationship, a dream, a role, or a version of yourself, the mind interprets it as something breaking. You feel something missing, something undone, something incomplete. This reaction comes from the belief that what was lost was a part of you. Losing it feels like losing a piece of your identity. This is why grief hurts so deeply. But there is another side to loss that often goes unseen. Loss removes what once filled space, and in doing so, it reveals new capacity. Capacity for growth, capacity for resilience, capacity for curiosity, capacity for creativity, capacity for deeper connection, capacity for a new kind of self-awareness, capacity that was previously hidden by what occupied that space. Loss does not simply take, it also makes room. Allowing loss to reveal capacity begins with giving yourself permission to grieve without judgment. Grief is not a mistake. It is not weakness. It is not a sign that you failed to detach. Grief is the natural response to change. It shows you what mattered. It reveals the depth of your connections. It exposes the tender parts of your heart. When you stop resisting grief, you allow it to shape you instead of break you. Grief becomes a teacher instead of a prison. One of the first shifts in this practice is realizing that emptiness is not the same as absence. Emptiness is potential. Absence is only the mind's interpretation of what is missing. When you sit with emptiness without labeling it as loss, you start to feel something subtle, a quiet spaciousness. This spaciousness is not the void your fear imagines. It is inner room you never knew you had. Loss clears the mind of old attachments and creates space for something you could not see before. Loss also reveals resilience you did not know you possessed. You discover your ability to endure pain, to continue walking through difficulty, to stay open even when life feels uncertain. You begin to see that strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the willingness to keep feeling while still choosing to move forward. Resilience is not a trait. It is a capacity awakened through loss. Another part of this teaching is understanding that endings uncover hidden creativity. When something familiar leaves your life, your mind must reorganize. It must find new perspectives, new ways of coping, new ways of understanding yourself. This process awakens parts of you that were asleep. You begin to notice ideas, insights, and intuitions that were once buried under routine, comfort, or attachment. Loss breaks patterns, and in breaking patterns, it reveals new ways of seeing. You may also notice that loss forces you to meet parts of yourself you never had to meet before. When someone supported you, you relied on their presence. When a role defined you, you relied on its structure. When a dream guided you, you relied on its direction. When these things fall away, you discover strengths you previously outsourced. You learn self-trust because you must. You learn self-guidance because you have no choice. Loss becomes a mirror that shows you who you are beneath what you held on to. Allowing loss to reveal capacity also means letting go of the idea that healing must look a certain way. Healing is not linear. It doesn't follow predictable stages. Some days you feel strong, and others you feel broken. Some days you feel clear, and others you feel lost. This fluctuation is not failure. It is the movement of emotional energy clearing space. When you stop forcing healing to be orderly, your capacity expands because you stop fighting the natural rhythm of your inner world. Another insight comes from seeing how loss purifies priorities. When something falls away, you see more clearly what matters and what does not. You stop wasting time on things that do not nourish you. You stop clinging to people who drain you. You stop investing energy in roles that diminish you. Loss sharpens your understanding of meaning. It reveals what you truly value. This clarity is a form of inner wealth. Loss also deepens compassion. When you feel your own grief fully, you become more sensitive to the suffering of others. You understand pain not as something to avoid, but as something to honor. You see that others carry their own invisible losses, and this understanding softens judgment. Compassion expands your capacity to love without clinging, to support without controlling, to hold space without needing to fix. Another important part of this practice is realizing that loss teaches you to trust the movement of life. You begin to see that endings are not punishments, but transitions. Even when something leaves unwillingly, even when the loss feels unfair, life continues to unfold. When you witness yourself surviving losses you once thought impossible, your trust deepens. You learn that life carries you forward even when you resist. You learn that you can walk through change and still remain whole. Allowing loss to reveal capacity also means recognizing that pain is not the end of the story. Pain is the beginning of transformation. Pain clears attachments. Pain opens space for new understanding. Pain strips away illusions. Pain forces honesty. Pain removes what blocks growth. Pain, when met directly, becomes the soil where deeper wisdom grows. As you learn to allow loss without collapsing, your sense of identity shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone who loses. You start seeing yourself as someone who transforms. The loss becomes part of your history, not your definition. You carry the experience, but you do not become the experience. This perspective liberates you from living in the shadow of the past. In time, the fear of loss weakens. You realize that while loss is painful, it does not destroy you. You realize that new parts of you awaken through every ending. You realize that inner space is not something to fear. It is something to welcome. That space allows you to breathe. It allows you to grow. It allows you to evolve. Loss becomes a doorway, not a wall. A teacher, not a thief. A beginning, not just an end. And from this new understanding, you are ready to explore the next teaching. How to leave situations gracefully, without bitterness, without attachment, and without carrying emotional residue forward. You've just seen how loss can reveal hidden strength, new space, and deeper wisdom. As that truth settles in, something inside you shifts again. Your relationship with endings becomes softer. They no longer feel like punishment. They begin to feel like transitions. But even with this understanding, there is another layer that quietly shapes your experience, the way you leave situations. Because not all endings happen to you. Some endings are choices. Some endings are steps you must take. And often, the hardest part is not letting something go, but leaving without leftover bitterness, guilt, or emotional residue. This next teaching touches that delicate place. There comes a moment in life when you realize that staying is more harmful than leaving. This could be a relationship that drains you, a job that suffocates you, a habit that weakens you, or an environment that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. Yet, even when you know it's time to go, walking away rarely feels simple. You carry fear, doubt, attachment, guilt, and hesitation. The exit becomes tangled in emotion. This is where the practice of the compassionate exit becomes essential. A compassionate exit is not about disappearing. It is not about avoiding discomfort. It is not about leaving impulsively. It is about stepping away in a way that honors both yourself and the situation you are releasing. It means leaving with clarity rather than anger. Leaving with understanding rather than blame. Leaving with intention rather than reaction. Leaving in a way that allows your heart to stay open, not guarded. The first part of a compassionate exit is honesty with yourself. You must acknowledge when something is no longer healthy, no longer aligned, no longer nourishing. People often stay in painful situations because they want to avoid hurting others or because they fear regret. But staying out of fear creates more harm in the long run. When you admit the truth without judgment, clarity emerges. You stop pretending. You stop hoping the situation will magically fix itself. You begin to see the necessity of stepping away. Once honesty is present, the next step is releasing blame. Blame makes leaving heavier. It traps you in the narrative of who was wrong, who failed, who disappointed you. Blame keeps you emotionally tied to what you're trying to leave. The goal of a compassionate exit is not to cast someone as the villain, even if the situation was painful. It is to recognize that conditions change, people change, needs change, and sometimes staying becomes incompatible with growth. Letting go of blame makes the departure lighter. A compassionate exit also requires emotional responsibility. It means acknowledging your part in the situation, your needs, your fears, your patterns, your unspoken expectations. This self-awareness prevents you from carrying the same unresolved issues into the next chapter of your life. When you take responsibility for your emotional experience, you leave with wisdom instead of wounds. Another important part of leaving with compassion is clear intention. You must know why you're stepping away, not to escape discomfort, but to protect your well-being, honor your boundaries, or follow a deeper truth. When your intention is grounded, the exit becomes an act of respect for yourself, rather than an act of rejection toward the other person or situation. One of the subtler skills in a compassionate exit is recognizing when explanation is needed and when it will create more harm. Sometimes clarity brings closure. Sometimes explanation reopens wounds or triggers defensiveness. Compassion means sensing what creates the most peace for everyone involved. It is not your responsibility to make someone fully understand your decision, but it is your responsibility to act with respect. A compassionate exit also requires emotional cleanup, not with others, but within yourself. You must release the stories you tell about the situation. You must loosen your grip on regrets. You must forgive yourself for not leaving sooner or staying longer. You must forgive the other person for their limitations. Without this internal cleanup, even if you leave physically, you remain emotionally stuck. True departure happens in the mind long before it happens in action. When leaving, there is also a tendency to replay the past, searching for signs, mistakes, or alternative outcomes. This mental looping keeps you tied to the situation you're walking away from. The compassionate exit teaches you to interrupt this loop by asking a simple question: what is this replay giving me right now? Usually the answer is nothing but pain. Redirecting attention to the present helps prevent emotional residue from piling up. Another essential part of this practice is setting boundaries with yourself. The mind will naturally revisit old attachments. It will want to check in, reattach, bargain, or reopen old conversations. Setting boundaries with yourself means gently redirecting your attention each time you feel pulled back. It means honoring your own decision. It means reminding yourself of the reasons you left, not to reinforce pain, but to reinforce clarity. Compassionate exiting also means allowing grief to arise without resisting it. Leaving something meaningful hurts, even when it is the right choice. A compassionate exit does not bypass grief. It respects it. Grief shows the depth of your connection. It reveals the care you had. It honors what was shared. When you let yourself feel the grief fully, it moves through you instead of getting stuck. This prevents bitterness from forming. Another aspect is learning to leave without burning bridges unless necessary. Sometimes distance is needed. Sometimes silence is needed. Sometimes firm boundaries are needed. But burning bridges out of anger creates more emotional residue. A compassionate exit leaves the bridge intact, even if you choose never to cross it again. This keeps your heart clean. Compassionate exiting also means not carrying the identity the situation gave you. If a job made you feel inadequate, you don't take that identity with you. If a relationship made you feel unworthy, you don't let that belief follow you. If a habit made you feel weak, you don't label yourself as weak. Leaving means shedding the identity you built inside that chapter. You step into the next phase without dragging old stories behind you. This practice teaches you that endings can be acts of love. Love for yourself, love for your well-being, love for your growth. A compassionate exit does not mean you didn't care. It means you cared enough to leave in a way that protects dignity. It means you choose peace over chaos. It means you release without revenge. When you leave with compassion, you create emotional space for new experiences. You welcome new relationships without comparing them to the old. You enter new environments without carrying mistrust. You explore new opportunities without the fear that history will repeat itself. You open to life again with a steady heart. In time, compassionate exiting becomes a deep form of wisdom. The ability to walk away without turning cold, to close doors without slamming them, to release without becoming bitter. This wisdom keeps your heart open even through endings. And with this open heart, you are ready to explore the next teaching. The subtle but powerful moment before reaction, the space where true liberation begins. You've just explored how to leave situations with clarity instead of bitterness, and something subtle begins to shift inside you. You start to feel how much freedom comes from choosing your exits wisely, from walking away without poisoning your heart, from releasing without destroying yourself. But now, another layer quietly emerges. The realization that most suffering doesn't come from leaving or staying. It comes from the moments where you react. Those flashes where emotion takes over before awareness has a chance to step in. Those tiny instants where you tense, defend, lash out, shut down, or overthink before you even realize what you're doing. This is where the deepest work happens. You are now ready to explore the most powerful pause in human experience, the moment before reaction. There is a space inside every experience, so small that most people never notice it. A gap between stimulus and response. An opening before emotion becomes behavior. A breath before the mind leaps into old patterns. This gap is where your entire spiritual practice comes alive, because in that gap, you are not your conditioning, you are not your past, you are not your habit, you are not your fear. You are pure awareness, choosing how to meet the moment. Most people live their lives skipping over this space entirely. Life triggers them, and they respond instantly. Someone raises their voice, and irritation surges. Someone criticizes them, and defensiveness rises. Something doesn't go as planned, and frustration appears. A memory surfaces, and sadness returns. A fear enters, and they panic. These reactions feel automatic, but they are not destiny. They are habits. Habits formed through years of repetition. The sacred gap is always there, but old conditioning fills it so quickly that you never see it. The first step in reclaiming this space is recognizing that reaction is not the same as response. Reaction is immediate, unconscious, driven by survival instincts. Response is conscious, chosen, and rooted in awareness. Reactions happen to you. Responses come from you. When you develop awareness of the gap, you gain the ability to respond rather than react. This is the foundation of liberation. This practice begins with slowing down your noticing. When a trigger arises before your mind forms a thought, your body reacts first. A tightening in the chest, a shift in breathing, a quickening of the pulse, a tension in the jaw. These sensations are early indicators that reaction is forming. If you can recognize these micro-signals, you enter the sacred gap. You interrupt the automatic pattern. The reaction loses its authority. The gap becomes wider when you name what is happening. Simply saying internally, reactivity is rising, or tension is here, brings you into awareness. Naming breaks the unconscious chain that leads to automatic behavior. You stop being inside the reaction and begin observing it. Observation itself is a form of freedom. You become the witness rather than the actor swept away by emotion. Another powerful aspect of the sacred gap is the breath. The breath always exposes your state before your mind does. When you feel your breath becoming shallow or irregular, that is the doorway. Instead of tightening into reaction, soften into awareness. Don't force the breath to behave. Simply notice it. This noticing pulls you out of unconsciousness. The reaction begins to lose momentum because it no longer has your full identification. Understanding this gap also means accepting that reaction is not the enemy. Reaction is simply old conditioning playing itself out. It is your nervous system trying to protect you based on outdated patterns. Instead of attacking yourself for having reactions, meet them with curiosity. Curiosity widens the gap even more. It turns reactive energy into information rather than threat. This is how you stop fighting yourself and begin learning from your inner patterns. The sacred gap also teaches humility. You realize how quickly the mind wants to take control. You see how fast the ego wants to defend itself. You see how old wounds try to guide your behavior. This humility softens you. It reminds you that reaction is part of being human, and noticing it is part of growing. Humility allows the gap to stay open long enough for wisdom to enter. Another important part of this practice is recognizing that reaction always wants urgency. Reaction creates pressure. Respond now. Punish. Withdraw. Protect. Prove. Control. Fix. The sacred gap interrupts this urgency. When you pause, even for a half second, you break the illusion that reaction must be immediate. You create space where patience can arise, and patience allows you to see the truth of the moment more clearly. This pause often reveals that the trigger was not about the present moment at all. Most reactions are echoes from old pain. You think you're reacting to a person or situation in front of you, but you're actually reacting to a memory, a fear, or a belief shaped long ago. When you pause, the emotional fog lifts. You begin to distinguish between the past and what is actually happening now. This clarity transforms your inner world. The gap also reveals something surprising. Reaction loses its power when you do not feed it. A reaction gains strength when you immediately obey it. When you pause, the reaction collapses. Not because you suppressed it, but because you stopped energizing it with automatic behavior. This is how you train your mind to stop pulling you into old loops. You break the pattern by refusing to reinforce it. With practice, the sacred gap becomes longer, not in time, but in awareness. What once felt like a split second begins to feel spacious. In that space, you can ask important questions. What is really happening right now? What emotion is rising beneath this? What does my body feel? What does this moment actually need? What action aligns with who I want to be? These questions don't require long thought. They arise naturally when awareness enters the gap, and awareness always brings clarity. The sacred gap is also where compassion grows. When you pause, you stop projecting your pain onto others. You stop carrying old wounds into new conversations. You stop responding from fear rather than understanding. Compassion grows because you are no longer trapped inside your reaction. You can see the other person more clearly, and you can see your own emotional patterns with honesty instead of judgment. This practice does more than reduce emotional suffering. It transforms your entire relationship with life. You become less impulsive. You become harder to provoke. You become more patient. You become more grounded. Your presence deepens because you stop losing yourself in every emotional wave. You learn to stay with yourself even in difficult moments. Over time, you begin to feel something profound. The gap is not just a pause. It is freedom. It is choice. It is clarity. It is the place where old patterns dissolve and new possibilities arise. It is the doorway between unconscious living and conscious living. It is where your awakening becomes practical. And as you begin to master this sacred pause, you are ready to step into the next truth, the one that reveals how much you cling not to your past self, but to the future version of you that you think you must become. You've just learned to recognize and enter the sacred gap before reaction, and something inside you begins to feel more spacious. You sense a growing steadiness, a growing ability to pause before falling into old habits. But as this power of the pause deepens, another pattern comes into focus. A quieter, more subtle attachment that doesn't live in the past or in your reactions, but in your vision of who you believe you should become. A future self you've been chasing for years. A future self you idolize. A future self that quietly pressures you every single day. This next teaching invites you to look at that inner attachment with honesty and tenderness. There is a version of yourself you carry in your mind, the ideal self, the one who is finally confident, finally healed, finally disciplined, finally successful, finally calm, finally complete. This imagined future self holds every quality you believe you lack. It becomes a symbol of the life you want and the person you hope to be. But instead of inspiring you, this image can begin to imprison you. It becomes something you measure yourself against constantly. Every flaw, every mistake, every slow day feels like failure because it does not match the ideal. This attachment to the future self creates hidden pressure. You push yourself to improve quickly. You criticize yourself for not growing fast enough. You compare your current life to the image in your mind. You believe happiness will come only once you become that perfect version of yourself. This creates a gap between who you are and who you think you must be. And you live trapped between the two, never fully resting. The first layer of this teaching is recognizing how deeply this ideal self influences your behavior. It governs your self-talk. It shapes your goals. It drives your perfectionism. It fuels your impatience. It makes you postpone joy until you reach a certain level of achievement or self-mastery. You start believing that you must arrive somewhere before you are allowed to feel peaceful. But this ideal self is always moving. No matter how far you climb, the image shifts, grows, and sits at the next horizon. It is an endless chase, Detaching from the future self you idolize means understanding that growth is not wrong, but worshipping an ideal self creates suffering. When you cling to an imagined version of yourself, you stop appreciating the person you are today. You stop noticing your progress. You overlook your strengths. You judge your current state as inadequate. This judgment becomes constant pressure, and pressure blocks growth rather than supporting it. The practice begins with seeing how this idealized future self was created. It came from comparison, from cultural expectations, from childhood wounds, from social pressure, from old fears, from dreams you formed before you understood yourself fully. The future self is not a destiny. It is a collage of influences. When you understand this, you stop treating it as a sacred truth. It loses its authority. Another part of releasing this attachment is noticing how the ideal self influences your emotional world. When you believe you must become someone specific, every setback feels personal. Every slow day feels like proof that you're failing. Every mistake turns into self-doubt. You start living with chronic dissatisfaction, never feeling enough. The ideal self becomes a silent critic, following you everywhere. Letting go of this critic opens space for self-compassion. This practice also requires acknowledging the fear behind the ideal self. The fear says, "I am not enough as I am," and so you build a future self you believe will finally make you worthy. But worthiness is not something you earn through improvement. It is something you discover through presence. When you release the belief that you must earn worthiness, the ideal self loses its grip. Another powerful insight is understanding that the future self is built on certainty. The belief that if you shape your life perfectly, you will protect yourself from pain. But life does not follow perfect lines. Perfection does not guarantee safety. Growth does not eliminate vulnerability. When you realize that the ideal self cannot save you from the realities of being human, you stop using it as a shield. You allow yourself to live without needing certainty. Letting go of the future self also transforms how you approach goals. Instead of striving from inadequacy, you begin to grow from sufficiency. Instead of chasing improvement out of fear, you explore growth out of curiosity. Instead of pushing yourself harshly, you support yourself gently. This creates sustainable growth because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are walking with yourself. Another layer of this practice is recognizing the subtle ways the ideal self keeps you disconnected from the present moment. When you're focused on becoming someone else, you miss the life happening right now. You miss small joys. You miss simple beauty. You miss connection. You miss opportunities. You miss presence. The future self steals the richness of the present by convincing you the present is not enough. Letting go returns you to now. As you detach, you begin to see that the real transformation happens in the present, not the future. The future self can never change you. Only the present self can. The present moment is where habits shift, where awareness grows, where healing happens. When you release the fantasy of becoming someone else, you begin to meet yourself honestly. This honesty opens the door to genuine change. Another profound part of this teaching is realizing that you are not meant to become a perfect version of yourself. You are meant to keep evolving. The future self you idolize is static, a fixed image. But you are not static. You are movement, change, flow. When you stop trying to fit yourself into a fixed image, you give yourself permission to evolve in ways you could never predict. You open to possibilities beyond the limits of your imagination. This detachment also brings relief from constant self-monitoring. When you stop comparing every moment to the ideal version of yourself, your mind relaxes. You stop over-analyzing your behavior. You stop judging your emotions. You stop evaluating your productivity. You stop measuring your worth. The inner critic becomes quieter because there is no longer an imaginary standard to uphold. As this practice deepens, you begin to feel compassion for yourself in a new way. You see how hard you've been on yourself. You see how much pressure you've carried. You see how long you've been chasing an image that kept shifting. Compassion softens the inner landscape. It creates space for real growth. It brings peace to the parts of you that felt they had to earn love. In time, the future self becomes lighter. It stops being a ruler and becomes a possibility. You can still dream. You can still set goals. You can still hope for growth. But you no longer attach your worth to those dreams. You no longer punish yourself for not matching an ideal. You no longer postpone peace. Growth becomes an expression of your inner freedom, not a requirement for it. And as this pressure dissolves, your attention naturally turns toward another form of clinging, the attachment to closure, the need for every story to make sense before you can rest. This is where your next step begins. You've just loosened your grip on the idealized future self, and something inside you gently exhales. The pressure to become someone perfect softens, and a quiet acceptance begins to settle in. But as this pressure dissolves, another truth appears. Life contains many chapters that do not resolve cleanly, conversations that never end properly, relationships without closure, answers you never receive, chances you never took, feelings that never got expressed. And a part of you still longs to fix these unfinished threads, to tie them neatly, to make everything make sense. This is where the next teaching unfolds, learning to stop resisting what remains incomplete. Life is full of unfinished cycles. Some moments simply end before you are ready. People leave suddenly. Opportunities dissolve. Circumstances shift. Emotions fade without explanation. Stories stop mid-sentence. The human mind is uncomfortable with this. It wants the world to feel tidy, coherent, resolved. It wants answers, explanations, and clear narratives. It wants to close every door so it can feel safe. But life is not built around the mind's desire for resolution. Life moves by its own rhythm, not in perfect arcs. Some stories end quietly. Some end abruptly. Some never end at all. They simply fade. The suffering comes not from the unfinishedness itself, but from the resistance to its lack of completion. The first part of accepting unfinished cycles is recognizing that not everything needs closure to be meaningful. Closure is often a mental fantasy, the belief that if you understood why something happened or ended, you would feel at peace. But understanding does not erase pain. Explanation does not rewrite history. Closure does not guarantee healing. Sometimes what you call closure is just a final attempt to control what has already passed. When you release the need for the perfect ending, you allow yourself to move forward without dragging unanswered questions behind you. Another layer of this teaching is seeing how the mind tries to rewrite the past. You replay conversations, wondering what you could have said differently. You revisit choices, imagining alternate paths. You rehearse explanations that were never given. This mental looping is an attempt to create a clean ending. But this rewinding does not close the cycle. It keeps it alive. Accepting that some stories remain open frees you from the exhausting cycle of mental repetition. Non-resistance to unfinished cycles does not mean ignoring your emotions. It means not letting them hold you hostage. When feelings arise from unresolved situations, you meet them with honesty. You allow sadness without trying to turn it into clarity. You allow confusion without trying to turn it into certainty. You allow longing without turning it into obsession. Feelings complete themselves when you stop demanding that situations complete themselves. This practice also teaches emotional maturity. Maturity is not having all the answers. It is the ability to live with unanswered questions without losing yourself. It is the capacity to hold discomfort gently instead of trying to erase it. It is the willingness to move forward even when the story did not end the way you wanted. This kind of maturity brings peace because it stops the inner war with reality. Another important insight is understanding that unfinished cycles do not mean failure. Many people believe that if something ended without resolution, they must have done something wrong. But life ends chapters for reasons you may never fully know. People leave because of their own timing, wounds, and growth. Opportunities dissolve because their purpose was already fulfilled. Change happens because it must. Releasing the belief that every ending must make sense removes the burden of self-blame. Non-resistance also invites you to see beauty in the incomplete. Some experiences shape you not by finishing, but by remaining open. Some lessons stay with you because they never found clean closure. Some people remain important because the story wasn't meant to be concluded. Incomplete moments can carry as much meaning as complete ones, sometimes more. This practice frees you from chasing what no longer exists. When you stop demanding closure from situations that cannot provide it, you reclaim your energy. You stop seeking answers from people who cannot give them. You stop waiting for apologies that may never come. You stop holding on to stories that have already ended. This release creates emotional space for new experiences to enter. Another powerful part of this teaching is learning to recognize when your need for closure is a form of resistance to change. Sometimes the desire for resolution is really a desire to keep the past alive. You believe that if you could just fix the story, you wouldn't have to let go of it. But clinging to unfinished cycles keeps you tied to the past. Letting them remain unfinished is what allows you to step into the present. A practical aspect of non-resistance is grounding yourself in the present moment. When the mind begins to search for closure, you gently redirect your attention to what is happening now. You focus on your breath. You feel your body. You notice your surroundings. You anchor yourself. This keeps you from spiraling into the mental loops that cling to old narratives. Another dimension to this practice is compassion for yourself and others. When you accept unfinished cycles, you stop demanding perfect behavior from yourself. You stop demanding perfect communication from others. You stop expecting life to move according to clean emotional timelines. This compassion softens your expectations and reduces suffering. Non-resistance to unfinished cycles also teaches surrender. Surrender is not giving up. It is allowing life to move without your constant supervision. It is acknowledging that not everything can be controlled, shaped, or finalized. It is trusting that even open-ended stories have value. Surrender makes space for inner peace, because peace comes not from having everything complete, but from allowing things to remain unfinished without fighting them. As you grow into this practice, the fear of loose threads begins to fade. You realize that life is not meant to be symmetrical. You realize that not every question needs an answer. You realize that not every ending needs a conclusion. You realize that clarity often comes later, when you are no longer seeking it. You realize that some understanding arrives only after you stop chasing it. Over time, you become someone who can honor the incomplete without collapsing into frustration. You become someone who can walk away gracefully from unresolved stories. You become someone who trusts the flow of life more than the desire for resolution. This trust brings you into deeper harmony with what is, not what should have been. And as this acceptance settles into your heart, you grow ready to face another subtle form of clinging, the quiet hunger for emotional validation, the longing for others to soothe wounds that can only be healed from within. You've just opened yourself to the truth that not every story receives a perfect ending. Something in you loosens when you stop forcing closure, when you stop chasing the answers that will never arrive, when you finally allow life to be unfinished. But as this surrender deepens, another pattern quietly rises from beneath the surface, a softer, more subtle attachment. It shows up in the way you wait for someone to reassure you, in the way you hope others will validate your feelings, in the way you look for signs that you matter, that you are understood, that you are seen. This longing seems gentle on the outside, but it shapes your emotional world more than anything else. You are now ready to step into this next layer, releasing the hunger for emotional validation. There is a quiet craving inside every person, a craving to be emotionally held by someone else. The desire to be understood, to be comforted, to be validated, to be reassured. This longing is not wrong, it is deeply human. But when this longing becomes your emotional foundation, it creates instability. Your inner state rises and falls, depending on how others respond to you. A kind word lifts you. A cold response discourages you. A delayed message worries you. A misunderstanding shakes you. Approval becomes relief, and absence becomes fear. The first step in releasing this hunger is recognizing that emotional validation is not the same as emotional support. Support is healthy. Connection is essential. But when you depend on others to stabilize your inner world, you lose your grounding. You hand over your peace. You hand over your worth. You hand over your emotional security. This dependency creates constant anxiety because you cannot control how others behave. This hunger often forms early in life. Many people grew up needing reassurance to feel safe, needing approval to feel loved, needing praise to feel worthy. These patterns continue into adulthood without being questioned. You may think you're seeking connection, but you're actually seeking permission to feel okay. This unconscious pattern becomes a quiet obsession. Every interaction becomes a test. Every silence becomes a threat. Every disagreement becomes proof of rejection. Breaking this cycle requires awareness, compassion, and truth. A powerful part of this practice is noticing the subtle ways you seek emotional validation. You may word things carefully to avoid disapproval. You may soften your truth to keep peace. You may over-explain your feelings, hoping someone will understand and reassure you. You may replay conversations in your mind to check how you were perceived. You may feel uneasy until someone confirms you are valued. These behaviors are signs that your emotional state is tied to external responses. Releasing this hunger does not mean becoming emotionally cold or detached. It means learning to hold your feelings without needing someone else to make them acceptable. When you validate your own emotions, you reclaim your power. You learn to feel sadness without asking someone to make it okay. You learn to feel fear without needing reassurance. You learn to feel joy without needing permission. Self-validation is the foundation of emotional independence. Another essential part of this practice is understanding that others cannot consistently meet your emotional needs, not because they do not care, but because they are dealing with their own inner worlds. People are distracted, overwhelmed, busy, or emotionally unavailable at times. When you rely on them for stability, you set yourself up for disappointment. When you rely on yourself, you create a dependable foundation that does not shift with others' moods or availability. This practice also teaches you to stop making emotional interpretations. When someone doesn't respond with the warmth you hoped for, you interpret it as rejection. When someone is distant, you believe it means they don't care. These stories reinforce your craving. Detaching from these interpretations brings clarity. You begin to understand that people's reactions are often about their own state, not your worth. This insight weakens the craving for reassurance. Releasing the hunger for emotional validation requires learning to soothe yourself. When discomfort arises, you pause instead of seeking someone to fix it. You ground yourself. You breathe deeply. You name what you feel. You accept your emotions without judgment. This inner soothing becomes your emotional anchor. You stop relying on others to calm your storms, and your storms become less intense because you meet them with presence. Another part of this practice is removing the pressure of emotional reciprocity. When you open your heart to someone, you may expect them to respond with equal vulnerability or affection. When they don't, you feel hurt. This hurt comes from expectation, not from reality. Emotional reciprocity is not guaranteed. People express themselves differently. When you release the demand for mirrored emotional energy, your relationships become healthier. You give without contracting. You receive without interpreting. You love without bargaining. Releasing this hunger also reveals how deeply you have tied your identity to how others feel about you. When someone withdraws affection, you question your worth. When someone misunderstands you, you question your clarity. When someone disapproves, you question your decisions. When you detach from this pattern, your identity becomes rooted inside you rather than in external reactions. You stop measuring yourself through others' eyes. A profound shift occurs when you stop chasing reassurance. You begin to trust your own perceptions. You begin to trust your own choices. You begin to trust your inner voice. This trust does not come from arrogance. It comes from presence. When you are deeply connected to yourself, you do not need constant external confirmation. You know what you feel. You know what you need. You know what is real for you. Another layer of this practice is understanding the difference between connection and emotional dependency. Connection enriches your life. Dependency drains it. Connection allows you to grow. Dependency traps you. Connection is free. Dependency is conditional. When you build relationships from emotional sufficiency rather than emotional hunger, you attract healthier dynamics. Your presence becomes calmer because it is not fueled by need. This practice also reveals which relationships were based on dependency rather than mutual respect. When you stop seeking constant validation, some connections weaken. The people who relied on your neediness for control or emotional significance may withdraw. This is not a loss, it is clarity. True connections deepen when neediness is replaced with authenticity. Self-validation also transforms conflict. When you no longer crave emotional reassurance, you stop collapsing into defensiveness or overreaction. You can hear criticism without crumbling. You can communicate honestly without fear. You can disagree without losing your sense of worth. This stability creates healthier communication and deeper maturity. One of the most beautiful outcomes of this practice is that your love becomes cleaner. When you don't need people to validate you, you allow them to be themselves. You love without pressure. You listen without needing anything back. You give without fear of rejection. Your affection becomes a gift, not a plea. This kind of love is rare, strong, and deeply healing for you and for others. Over time, the hunger for emotional validation becomes weaker. You begin to feel whole even when someone doesn't respond the way you hoped. You begin to feel grounded even when you are misunderstood. You begin to feel steady even when others are distant. You begin to feel confident even when no one praises you. This is emotional freedom. And from this freedom, another layer of detachment becomes possible. Learning how not to hold on to experiences longer than they belong. How to stop letting moments linger inside you long after they have passed. You've just loosened the longing for emotional reassurance, and something inside you starts to feel lighter. You begin to sense a growing independence in your heart, a calmness that comes from not needing others to constantly confirm your worth. But as this new stability rises, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Even when you no longer seek validation, the mind still tends to hold on. It holds on to comments, to memories, to past experiences, to old wounds, to tiny moments that should have passed long ago. This subtle holding keeps your inner world crowded. It fills your emotional space with echoes. It keeps you reliving things that were meant to be brief. Now you are ready to explore the next freedom, the freedom of non-retaining. There is a quiet tendency in the mind to preserve experiences far beyond their natural lifespan. A stranger's remark, a moment of embarrassment, an argument that ended days ago, a disappointment that happened years ago. The mind keeps these alive, turning them into emotional residue. Instead of allowing moments to flow through you, the mind grabs them, stores them, and repeats them. This habit creates heaviness because you carry far more than the present requires. Non-retaining does not mean forgetting everything or suppressing memory. It means not feeding experiences with emotional importance once they've served their purpose. It means letting moments end when they end. It means not turning passing events into identity. When you stop retaining every emotional impression, your inner world becomes spacious, calm, and resilient. The first step in practicing non-retaining is noticing how quickly the mind forms attachments to experiences. Something happens, and instantly the mind labels it, judges it, and stores it. A compliment becomes a story about your worth. A criticism becomes a story about your flaws. A small mistake becomes a story about your identity. These stories do not represent reality. They represent the mind's habit of turning moments into meaning. To detach from this habit, you start by seeing experiences as events rather than reflections of the self. Someone's words are just words. A feeling is just a feeling. A situation is just a situation. None of these are permanent. None of these define you. None of these deserve to be carried as emotional weight. When you stop interpreting experiences as personal commentary on your worth, retention weakens. Non-retaining also requires understanding how long certain experiences should stay. Some moments need your attention briefly, to learn from, to understand, to process. But after that, they lose their usefulness. Yet the mind continues to revisit them, turning memory into suffering. Practicing non-retaining means recognizing the natural expiration point of an experience. Once it has taught you what it can teach, you let it dissolve. A powerful part of this practice is learning to feel without storing. When a strong emotion arises, you allow it fully. You feel sadness, anger, joy, fear, or disappointment with openness. But when the emotion finishes its natural cycle, you do not hold on to it through thought. You do not replay the moment. You do not analyze it endlessly. You do not weave it into identity. The emotion completes itself and becomes empty. This ability to feel deeply without retaining is a sign of emotional maturity. Non-retaining also teaches you to stop rehearsing the past. Rehearsal is one of the primary ways the mind keeps experiences alive. You replay scenes, predict how they could have gone differently, search for hidden meaning, or punish yourself for past decisions. This rehearsal does not protect you. It traps you. When you notice yourself looping mentally, you gently return to presence. You interrupt the habit by asking, "Does this need to stay?" Often, the answer is no. Another layer of this practice involves letting go of both positive and negative retention. People often cling to pleasant experiences because they fear losing them. They replay praise, nostalgia, or moments of joy as a way to feel secure. But even holding on to positive experiences creates suffering because life keeps moving. When you retain the past, even beautiful moments become barriers to new presence. Non-retaining means appreciating moments fully, but not clinging once they pass. A deep insight arises when you realize that the mind's habit of retaining experiences is connected to the illusion of identity. The mind believes that what happens to you is you, so it collects experiences to reinforce the idea of a solid self. When you practice non-retaining, you loosen the identity built from memories. You begin to see yourself not as the accumulation of what has happened, but as the awareness in which everything happens and disappears. This shift creates profound freedom. Another essential part of this practice is working with the body. Retention doesn't live only in thought. It lives in muscle, breath, and posture. When you hold on to an experience mentally, your body often holds on to it physically. A painful memory tightens the stomach. An argument from years ago tenses the jaw. A disappointment contracts the chest. Non-retaining means noticing when the body continues to hold something long after the moment has passed. When you breathe into that area, soften and release, the memory loses its grip. This practice also transforms your relationships. When you stop retaining emotional impressions, you no longer build resentment. You don't keep score. You don't punish people for old mistakes. You don't carry conflicts into new conversations. You respond to what is happening now rather than reacting from the past. This makes connections cleaner, more honest, and less burdened by emotional baggage. Non-retaining requires trust. Trust that life will bring new moments. Trust that letting go does not erase what matters. Trust that meaning does not need to be preserved through clinging. Trust that you are safe even when you release your grip on the past. This trust grows slowly, but each moment of letting go strengthens it. The practice also changes how you respond to difficulty. When something painful happens, you process it, but do not keep it alive. You learn the lesson and let the pain go. You feel the emotion and let it pass. You acknowledge the experience and let it settle. You stop reopening old wounds by revisiting them mentally. This reduces unnecessary suffering and keeps your emotional world balanced. Non-retaining also dissolves the idea that you need to hold on to experiences for identity. When you let experiences pass, your identity becomes fluid. You stop defining yourself by old moments. You stop seeing yourself as the person who suffered, the person who failed, the person who was betrayed. You begin to see yourself as someone constantly being renewed. This creates humility, openness, and freedom. As you practice non-retaining, you feel a growing lightness. You notice your mind is less crowded, your emotions settle more quickly, your reactions become softer, your presence deepens. You begin to experience life directly instead of through the weight of accumulated impressions. And as this spacious inner world expands, you naturally move into another essential dimension of detachment, being present for others with compassion, without absorbing their suffering as your own. You've just stepped into the freedom of non-retaining, and already your inner space feels cleaner. Experiences come and go without leaving permanent marks. Old memories loosen. Heavy emotions no longer take root. But as this clarity expands, another truth rises gently to the surface. Even when you stop holding on to your own experiences, you may still hold what others feel. You may carry their sadness. You may internalize their fear. You may absorb their pain as if it were your own. This softness comes from kindness, but without wisdom, kindness becomes self-wounding. Now you are ready for the next part of detachment, compassion without fusion. There is a difference between caring and merging, but the line between the two can be thin. Many people who are deeply empathetic feel responsible for the emotional states of others. They believe that to show love, they must absorb someone's suffering. They take on others' sadness, stress, and anxiety, hoping that carrying the weight will help lighten it. But emotional fusion does not heal. It only doubles the suffering, for you and for them. The first step in compassion without fusion is recognizing that empathy is not the same as ownership. Empathy means you can feel what someone else is going through. Fusion means you internalize it as your own emotional truth. This fusion often comes from old conditioning, from childhood environments where you learn to stay safe by tuning into others' emotions, or from relationships where you were rewarded for putting others' needs above your own. These patterns feel like care, but they are actually self-abandonment. Compassion without fusion teaches you to stay open without collapsing. It means you can listen deeply without taking responsibility for someone else's emotional process. It means you can hold space without carrying their pain inside you. You become a presence, not a container. You become supportive, not absorbing. This is how compassion becomes sustainable. A powerful aspect of this practice is understanding the difference between connection and entanglement. Connection honors the boundaries between two people. Entanglement dissolves them. When you fuse with another person's suffering, you lose clarity. You can no longer see what belongs to you and what belongs to them. This creates confusion and exhausts your emotional energy. Compassion without fusion restores this clarity. To develop this practice, begin by noticing your body. When someone shares their pain, your body often responds before the mind. Your chest tightens, your breath shortens, your shoulders rise. This physical response is your nervous system trying to match the other person's emotional energy. By observing these sensations early, you can prevent emotional fusion before it happens. Compassion without fusion requires grounding. Grounding means staying anchored in your own inner space, even when someone else is emotional. You feel your feet, your breath, your body. You maintain awareness of your own emotional state. This grounding creates a boundary that is not rigid but porous. You can feel what others feel, but you are not consumed by it. Another essential part of this teaching is understanding responsibility. You are responsible for showing kindness, presence, and support. You are not responsible for fixing someone's emotions, carrying their burdens, or healing their wounds. The belief that you must solve someone else's emotional pain is a hidden form of attachment. It keeps you entangled in their suffering and prevents them from developing their own emotional resilience. Compassion empowers. It does not rescue. You also learn to trust that others are capable of carrying their own experience. Emotional fusion often arises from fearing that someone cannot handle their emotions. So you step in too far, too deeply, too quickly. But when you believe in another person's capacity, your presence becomes supportive without becoming invasive. You offer understanding, not absorption. You offer care, not rescue. You offer listening, not merging. Compassion without fusion also transforms communication. Instead of reacting to someone's suffering with anxiety or over-involvement, you learn to respond with calm presence. This calmness is not detachment in the cold sense. It is emotional steadiness. Your steadiness becomes grounding for the other person. You show them that pain can be held without panic, that emotions can move without overwhelming. Your calm becomes a mirror that helps them access their own strength. Another key aspect of this practice is relating to emotions as energy, not identity. When someone expresses intense emotion, it is easy to mistake that emotion as something solid, something that needs to be carried. But emotions are movements. They rise, peak, and fall. When you fuse emotionally, you freeze the movement. When you stay compassionate without merging, you allow their emotions to keep moving through them, not into you. Boundaries are essential, not walls. boundaries. Walls shut people out. Boundaries allow connection but protect your inner world. Setting boundaries means recognizing when you are reaching your emotional limit. It means stepping back when you feel overwhelmed. It means saying no without guilt. It means protecting your peace without abandoning your care. Compassion without fusion also requires self-respect. When you respect your emotional space, you refuse to let others' chaos define your inner state. You understand that being a supportive presence does not mean sacrificing your internal equilibrium. Respecting yourself allows you to give from fullness rather than emptiness. This makes your compassion healthier and more sustainable. One of the deepest teachings in this practice is learning to stay with your own emotions even when someone else is expressing theirs. Emotional fusion often happens because your own unresolved emotions get activated. Someone else's sadness awakens your old sadness. Someone else's anger awakens your fear. Someone else's anxiety awakens your insecurity. When you learn to hold your emotions separately, you stop blending them with others. This preserves clarity and emotional integrity. Compassion without fusion also means not using someone else's suffering as a distraction from your own. Sometimes emotional merging is a way to avoid facing your own pain. You focus on them because it feels safer than dealing with yourself. This pattern keeps the cycle of fusion alive. By staying grounded in your inner world, you prevent this unconscious avoidance. Another layer of this teaching is learning to offer presence without expectations. When you help someone, you may unconsciously expect appreciation, reciprocity, or emotional closeness. When these expectations are unmet, you feel hurt. This hurt reveals emotional fusion. Compassion without fusion means helping without demanding emotional returns. Your care becomes a gift, not a transaction. As you deepen this practice, you discover that compassion is not weakened by boundaries. It is strengthened. You can give more authentically. You can listen more clearly. You can be present without exhaustion. You can love without drowning. This is compassion that nourishes rather than depletes. Over time, compassion without fusion becomes second nature. You maintain your center while offering support. You stay rooted even when others are hurting. You embody calmness even in emotional storms. You create space for healing without carrying the weight yourself. And from this balanced compassion grows the next layer of letting go, the soft power of yielding, where you release the need to push against life and learn the quiet strength of surrender. You've just learned how to stay open to others without losing yourself, how to care deeply without collapsing into their pain. That already shifts something very deep inside you. You begin to sense that you don't always have to carry, push, or rescue. But now another truth starts to quietly reveal itself. You don't just grip people, you grip life itself. You tense against outcomes. You brace against change. You fight with time, with feelings, with circumstances. There is a hidden belief that if you don't push, nothing will move. If you don't force, nothing will work. If you don't fight, life will crush you. This next teaching gently challenges that belief, showing you that some of the greatest strength comes not from pushing, but from yielding. Yielding is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Many people confuse it with weakness, passivity, or giving up. They think surrender means letting life walk all over them. They think softness means being defeated. But real yielding is something entirely different. It is the choice to stop pushing where pushing doesn't help. It is the wisdom to move with life instead of colliding with it. It is the quiet courage to trust the flow more than your fear. You can feel the difference between pushing and yielding in your body. When you push, your muscles tighten, your jaw locks, your breath becomes shallow, your thoughts speed up. You feel like you're trying to drag reality into your preferred shape. This dragging brings resistance. The more you push, the more life pushes back. Your plans fall apart. People don't follow your script. Outcomes don't match your expectations. Exhaustion grows, not because life is attacking you, but because you are constantly leaning against what is. Yielding feels completely different. When you yield, your body softens, your breath deepens, your mind becomes more spacious. You stop trying to bend reality and instead start listening to it. You still act, you still choose, you still move forward, but your actions come from alignment rather than tension. You aren't working against life, you're working with it. This creates a sense of effort that feels natural instead of forced. The essence of yielding is responsiveness. Instead of clinging to a rigid plan, you pay attention to what is actually happening. If a door doesn't open, you don't keep slamming into it. You step back, observe, and look for another door. If someone clearly shows you their limits, you don't keep forcing the connection to fit your fantasy. You adjust, accept, and relate to who they are instead of who you wish they were. If your body is sending signals of exhaustion, you don't ignore it in the name of discipline. You listen and adapt. This is not laziness. It is intelligent cooperation with reality. In Taoist and Buddhist wisdom, this is called acting without strain, effort that comes from harmony, not from inner conflict. It means you still work, you still practice, you still grow, but your energy is not wasted resisting what cannot be changed. You reserve your strength for what can shift, what can be influenced, what is ready to move. Yielding also exposes how often your suffering comes not from the event itself, but from your insistence that it be different. Something difficult happens, and the mind immediately says, "This should not be happening." That statement becomes a wall inside you. You bounce off it again and again. Yielding doesn't ask you to love what is painful. It simply means you stop arguing with the fact that it already exists. Once you stop arguing, you can finally respond. This surrender is not to fate, it is to truth. Truth that the moment is already here. Truth that time doesn't reverse. Truth that clinging doesn't undo events. When you bow inwardly to that truth, you reclaim the energy that was trapped in denial. That energy is what allows you to act wisely. You can see the power of yielding clearly in nature. A rigid branch breaks in strong wind, flexible grass bends and then stands upright again. A river doesn't punch through rocks. It flows around them, slowly shaping them over time. Yielding doesn't mean the river is weak. It means it is patient and unstoppable in a different way. It moves with the path in front of it, not against it. In your daily life, yielding looks like this. You stop forcing conversations with people who aren't ready to hear you. You stop insisting that your timeline is the only valid one. You stop arguing mentally with emotions that arise. You stop demanding that your mind be calm right now. You stop treating every challenge as something that must be crushed by willpower. Instead, You start asking softer questions. What is life showing me through this? What wants to move here if I stop fighting? What can I release instead of control? Where is the path opening naturally? These questions are the language of yielding. They turn you from a fighter into a listener, from a controller into a participant. Yielding also helps you see the difference between resistance and wise boundaries. Yielding does not mean you allow harmful situations to continue. It does not mean you say yes when you need to say no. It does not mean you abandon your voice. It means you stop trying to change what cannot be changed from the outside and instead shift what you do have power over. Where you place your attention, how you respond, whether you stay or walk away, whether you grip or release. Sometimes yielding will mean stepping back, not in defeat, but in clarity. You recognize that no amount of pushing will transform certain dynamics, and so you choose not to spend your life wrestling them. You let go of the fantasy that you can bend everything into your preference. You allow some things to be as they are without giving them the power to dictate your inner peace. Yielding is deeply linked to trust. Not blind trust that everything will be pleasant, but grounded trust that you can meet whatever comes. When you don't trust yourself, you cling to control. When you begin to trust your capacity to adapt, you relax your grip. You know that even if events change unexpectedly, you will be able to respond. This confidence makes surrender easier, because surrender doesn't feel like falling into emptiness. It feels like resting into your own resilience. There is also a spiritual dimension to yielding. When you stop trying to manage every detail of your life, you become available to a kind of guidance that cannot be accessed when you are tense. Intuition gets louder. Insight appears more often. Synchronicities become noticeable, not because the world suddenly changed, but because your inner noise quieted enough to notice the signals that were always there. Yielding creates silence where wisdom can speak. One of the more subtle forms of non-yielding is the urge to constantly fix yourself. You may try to push yourself into enlightenment, to force detachment, to rush your healing, to demand permanent calmness. This creates an internal war. One part of you policing the other. Yielding here means letting your growth unfold at its own pace. You still practice, but you stop punishing yourself for not transforming instantly. You let understanding sink in, layer by layer, like water soaking into soil. Yielding also changes how you deal with failure. When you push, failure feels like a personal insult, a verdict, a wall. When you yield, failure becomes feedback. You readjust rather than collapse. You see what conditions were missing instead of attacking your character. You learn to bend around disappointment, not shatter under it. Another area where yielding is powerful is in conversations and conflict. When you push, you try to win, to convince, to force agreement. This creates tension and defensiveness. When you yield, you still speak honestly, but you release the demand that others must see things your way. You listen as much as you talk. You allow differences to exist without needing to erase them. Paradoxically, this softening often brings more understanding than force ever could. Yielding doesn't remove all pain from life. Things will still end. People will still leave. Plans will still fail. Emotions will still rise. But when you stop pushing against these waves and start moving with them, suffering decreases. Pain may still visit, but it doesn't become a permanent resident. You are no longer torn between what is and what should be in every moment. That inner split starts to heal. Over time, yielding becomes less of a technique and more of a posture you live from. You act when action is needed, rest when rest is needed, speak when speaking is right, stay silent when silence is wiser. You start feeling which situations call for effort and which call for release. You begin to sense the rhythm of life, and you let that rhythm guide you instead of constantly trying to override it. From this softer, wiser way of moving through the world, another possibility opens up. The courage to drop your need to defend yourself, to stop proving, explaining, and justifying who you are. Because once you stop pushing against life, the next step is learning how to stop pushing against yourself. You've just stepped into the soft power of yielding, learning how to stop pushing against life and instead move with its natural flow. That alone creates a deep internal shift, a loosening of the inner fists that once clenched around control. But as you soften into life, you begin to notice another kind of tension that still lives inside you. A tension that doesn't show up in your muscles or your breath, but in the way you respond when someone questions you, misunderstands you, doubts you, or criticizes you. A subtle tightening of identity, a quick rise of explanation, a sudden urge to protect your image. This reflex reveals one of the deepest attachments of all, the need to defend yourself. Now, you are ready for the teaching that dissolves this reflex from its roots. There is a moment, small and sharp, when someone says something that hits your ego. It could be a simple misunderstanding or a harsh judgment. It could be a suggestion that makes you feel inadequate, or a tone that makes you feel dismissed. In that moment, something inside you activates. A voice rises quickly, insisting, you have to explain yourself, you have to correct them, you have to prove you're right, you have to protect how they see you. This is the impulse of defensiveness, a deeply conditioned response that arises not from truth, but from fear. Defensiveness comes from the belief that your worth is fragile, that if someone misunderstands you, you lose value, that if someone criticizes you, you are diminished, that if someone disapproves, you are unsafe. This belief forces you into constant self-justifying. You polish your image, you over-explain your motives, you replay conversations trying to sound perfect, you correct small misunderstandings even when they don't matter. You defend your choices endlessly. This creates exhaustion because you are constantly performing a version of yourself for others to accept. The quiet courage of non-defensiveness begins with recognizing that you do not need to protect what is true. Truth is stable. Truth does not require debate. Truth does not collapse under misunderstanding. When you know yourself clearly, you no longer panic when others don't. You stop trying to control how you are perceived. You release the obsession with being right, understood, admired, or validated. Non-defensiveness does not mean staying silent in the face of harm. It does not mean accepting disrespect. It does not mean letting people walk over you. It means choosing your responses from clarity rather than ego. You speak when needed, but not to protect identity, only to protect integrity. You correct when necessary, but without the desperation that comes from fear. You express yourself honestly, then let go of how others receive it. A powerful aspect of this practice is learning to let misunderstandings exist without chasing correction. Many misunderstandings are harmless. Many will resolve on their own. Many are rooted in the other person's perception, not in your truth. When you let these misunderstandings remain, something incredible happens. You feel freedom where you once felt pressure. You realize that not every wrong judgment needs to be fixed. Not every misinterpretation deserves your energy. Not every opinion about you is your responsibility to manage. This is where courage enters, the courage to be seen imperfectly. Non-defensiveness also means recognizing when defensiveness rises in the body. Often it starts with a tightening in the chest, a heat in the face, a sudden tension in the shoulders, a rush of thoughts preparing arguments. This is the ego preparing for battle. By noticing this physical reaction, you create space between the trigger and your response. In that space, you can choose truth over impulse. You breathe, you let the heat settle. You see the reaction without immediately following it. This pause is the beginning of liberation. Another part of this teaching is understanding that defensiveness closes your mind. When the ego rises, you stop listening. You become focused on protecting your identity instead of understanding the situation. You hear not the words but the threat. You interpret not the intent but the implication. This blocks learning. It blocks connection. Non-defensiveness opens your mind again. It lets you listen with curiosity instead of fear. It allows you to receive feedback without collapsing into shame. Non-defensiveness also transforms relationships. When you stop reacting defensively, conversations become softer. You hear what others actually mean instead of what your ego fears they mean. Others feel safer speaking to you. Communication becomes less of a battlefield and more of a dialogue. This does not make you passive. It makes you powerful in a different way, a way rooted in clarity rather than reactivity. One of the deepest insights in this practice is recognizing that you do not need to win. The ego thrives on winning arguments, winning approval, winning debates. But most arguments are not about truth. They are about identity. When you release the need to be right, you gain something far more valuable: peace. You begin to ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Is this worth my inner stability? Most of the time, the answer is no. Non-defensiveness also creates emotional independence. Your sense of self no longer rises and falls based on what others say. Their opinions lose their emotional weight. Praise feels pleasant but not defining. Criticism feels informative but not devastating. Disagreement feels normal rather than threatening. The less you defend yourself, the stronger you feel, because strength is no longer tied to approval. This way of being also reveals a hidden truth. You cannot control how others see you, no matter how hard you try. People filter the world through their own wounds, fears, biases, and history. You could be perfect in your words, flawless in your behavior, and still someone will misunderstand you. Accepting this brings tremendous peace. You stop fighting battles you cannot win. You stop wasting life trying to control perceptions that were never yours to shape. Practicing non-defensiveness also builds self-trust. When you stop explaining yourself to maintain approval, you begin validating your own intentions. You begin standing firmly in your truth. You begin trusting your inner voice. You begin feeling rooted even in conflict. This inner rooting is the opposite of ego. It is presence. It is grounded confidence. It is knowing who you are without needing others to confirm it. As this practice deepens, you learn the rare skill of responding without ego. You speak softly even when you feel challenged. You stand your ground without hostility. You withdraw from conflict without guilt. You express your needs without apology. Your clarity becomes your armor. Your calmness becomes your strength. Your non-defensiveness becomes your protection. Not because you fight, but because you no longer give the ego what it wants. And as this inner quietness grows, another layer of clinging becomes visible. The attachment to certainty. The need to always know what will happen next. The desire to secure the future before it arrives. Now you are ready to face the mind's oldest addiction, the craving for certainty itself. You've walked through a long and powerful journey, one that has peeled back layer after layer of what keeps the mind tangled, heavy, reactive, and afraid. And now, standing here at the end, you can feel something different within you. You've learned that letting go isn't something you force. It's something that happens when you stop gripping. You've seen how acceptance is not weakness, but deep intelligence, the kind that frees you from unnecessary suffering. You discovered that. You don't have to carry every emotion as yours. You don't have to believe every story your mind tells. You don't have to punish your mind for drifting. You just return gently. You don't have to live chained to expectations. Sincerity is enough. You don't have to wait for a perfect moment. The present is already here. You don't have to force your body into calm. You let it soften. You don't have to fear loss. It uncovers strength. You don't have to finish every story. Some are meant to stay open. You don't have to beg for reassurance. You can soothe yourself. You don't have to retain what hurts. Moments pass when you let them. You don't have to absorb others' pain. Compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. You don't have to push against life. Yielding has its own power. You don't have to defend your worth. Truth stands without armor. All of this leads to one simple, profound principle. Accept what comes. Release what goes. Because life is not meant to be held. It's meant to be lived, breathed, experienced, moved through. And if this journey opened even one new door inside you, if one sentence softened you, if one insight stayed with you, if one shift helped you breathe more freely, your reflection might be the exact message someone else needs to hear. And if you want more teaching